Chapter 1086. Silem's breathing became uneven, and his pupils couldn't seem to constrict any more. Each and every one of Lionel's words seemed perfectly measured and dialed in, every syllable controlling the beating of his heart. He couldn't seem to control his body anywhere near as easily as he had done in the past. It all felt quite disconnected and disjointed to me. The Krars, as you can see by how easily Earth handled them in this war, are quite weak. Despite being a powerhouse of this quadrant, the only advantage they really have are numbers. But many of their territorial planets are still within the fourth dimension, while their fifth-dimensional existences simply didn't have the talent to match up to us. But I couldn't help but notice that despite the fact Balthorn and her elder brother were among the greatest talents Krars had to offer, I didn't catch even a glimpse of them during this war. In fact, there wasn't a hint of the Valinor family, at least not on a scale that would make sense for one of the supposed three most powerful families of Krars. I became intrigued. That was when the Radix family's records fell onto my lap. I guess I really have to thank your five heads for trying to deal with us like you had, or else I would have never gotten the information I needed to end all of this so quickly. You might not understand where I'm coming from, so I can explain it. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. When the Radix began their preparation for storming the Milky Way galaxy, they did multiple risk assessments. They were quite well aware that there were many supremely powerful entities eyeing Earth, and they were also aware that it was impossible that these supreme powers wouldn't have made any moves yet. It was easier to believe that those powers were simply still lying low, waiting for an opportune time to strike. In that case, they had probably sunk their roots deep into well-established families. In fact, it might be possible that the reason some of these families and organizations grew powerful in the first place was due to the puppet strings of these hidden powers. So the Radix did a risk assessment. They began an analysis of all the powers of the Milky Way, big and small, all for the sake of drawing lines around which toes they shouldn't step on. But once again, much like your reaction to Radlease, the Krars passed with flying colors and were designated as no risk at all. Quite baffling, don't you think? I thought it was baffling too, until one of Earth's geniuses with a mind-reading ability tried to look into the memories of two princes we had captured, D and Dre. Silem froze, but Lionel's next words made him shudder. No, it was more accurate to say that his laughter did exactly that. He felt like he was being toyed with. Once again there was nothing. Their memories were frighteningly clean. Everything about them was completely orderly, not a thing out of place, not a step out of line. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. At this point, my theories were running on fumes. I have no information on anything, no proof of anything. I only have a few anecdotal experiences. But that was when something interesting happened to me. Lionel smiled lightly, scratching the back of little Blackstar's ear. The little one seemed to like that very much, yawning and sticking out his little pink tongue as though he might fall asleep at any point now. You can probably tell by my demeanor that I don't really like leaving loose ends, and that I might be meticulous to a fault. Well, a few weeks back, I had a battle with the Evergreen religion. They were among the first to set foot on Earth, but we made quick work of them. Unfortunately, one of them managed to escape, and this escape had been nagging at me for a very long time already. Luckily, thanks to the Radix family's risk assessment analysis, the Evergreen religion's main shrine had been marked as a warning zone. Now, I finally knew where this last enemy had likely escaped to, so I went to scout out the situation and hopefully snub any subsequent planned attack before it could even take form. But you'd be surprised to know that not only did I find not a single soul at the shrine, all that was left was a pungent smell of roses and blood. It was the kind of strong scent that could make one either pass out or throw up, but there was a very select few that could bask in it without worries, wearing it as a light fragrance. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Silem trembled fiercely. Even Vice's spatial lock couldn't seem to stop the innate physiological reaction. It seems that you're getting it now, HM? You're better than I was back then, because I was baffled. No matter how ignorant I was, I could tell that something very bad happened to this shrine, but I had no way of knowing exactly what that was. Until I cheated a little bit. Lionel flipped his palm over to reveal a small silver disc. I have to say that my father rarely gets serious about anything. He's the kind of man that can turn even his own son's heartbreak into a joke. However, the moment I set the analysis of the little silver disc on that scene just a few days ago, I saw my father get serious for just the third time in my life. A recording flickered, and it replayed the image of Lionel's father staring off into the distance in somewhat of a daze. It was clear that when this original clip played, he would have been staring into the shrine of the evergreen goddess. You ran into this sooner than I thought you would, brat. Remember this scene well, but remember this name even more. The Three-Finger Cult. It's they who are responsible for your grandfather's death. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Chapter 1087. Lionel's palm flipped and the rest of the message was cut short. You see, I'm not a very sentimental person. It's very easy for me to not care about things, even if I once cared for them in the past. There are very few things in life that can weigh me without very concrete stipulations being met. However, Lionel's expression darkened, the aura around him growing several levels heavier. It felt to Xylem as though he was within a whirlwind of murderous intent, his heart threatening to leap out from his throat. My father is a man who exists beyond those stipulations for me. His rage is my rage. His sadness is my sadness. His love is my love. To dare to touch my grandfather, a man my father so clearly cares so deeply for. I sentenced this three-finger cult to death the moment I heard its name. Xylem's gaze rolled back, his consciousness almost passing out completely. However, before his mind could go completely blank, Lionel's rage receded like a tide, leaving Xylem like a small boat swaying in the wind. With this new information my father brought me, finding the traces of the three-finger cult was far easier than it was before, and it wasn't long before I realized that as clean as the Valinor family was, they weren't nearly clean enough to escape my deduction. Visit. For a better user experience, the trouble was I had all these loose ends that had yet to be tied together. I had ultimately lucked out in stumbling upon the conclusion, but the road leading to it was still fuzzy and couldn't be quite pieced together. Until, that is, I learned that the Three-Finger Cult had a Shadow Fox bloodline within its ranks. Sorry, I mean the Shadowtail bloodline, right? Xylem couldn't even meet Lionel's gaze any longer. Yes, it was true that they had changed the name of their bloodline from Shadowtail to Shadow Fox. The truth was that their lineage factor had nothing to do with foxes at all. As for the true nature, even Xylem didn't know. This was a truth kept stored away so that the Umbra family would be able to continue hiding away. Of course, Xylem didn't know that Lionel was lying through his teeth. What truly connected all of this for Lionel was actually Senior Lou. The very same poor sap Aina had killed and Lionel had ultimately gotten the ring that led him to the silver tablet from. When Lionel originally investigated Senior Lou, he didn't find anything special. He was a normal youth and didn't have anything special about him. The only thing of slightest interest was that he was from Krars. Visit. For a better user experience just like this, everything was pieced together. Why would the Three-Finger Cult infiltrate the Krars Empire of all powers they could have chosen if not for this reason? Everything began to tie in one after another once this was understood. After managing to hide away from the Three-Finger Cult for so long, the Umbra family definitely had their methods of detecting and avoiding their capture. However, it would also be the case that the Umbra would likely feel that they couldn't simply hide away forever. In this way, the Umbra family was a lot like the Flora family. They were more powerful than they showed on the surface, but they had to continue to maintain a low profile. And in the case of the Umbra, the only way they could guarantee their survival was by rising up to one day matching the strength of the cult they left behind. Doing so by normal means was impossible. Lionel didn't quite know just how powerful the Three-Finger Cult was, but if it could kill his grandfather and make his father so serious, there was no doubt that he needed to treat it with the utmost respect as well. It was likely, then, that before separating from this cult for whatever reason, the Umbra family caught wind of some of its plans and chose to get a step ahead of them. With how powerful the silver tablet was, Lionel had no doubt that in the hands of a powerful family, it could cause a qualitative change in their strength given just a single generation. Putting this into perspective, it was no wonder the Umbra would be willing to take this risk. Unfortunately for both parties, The ring landed in Lionel's hand and not theirs. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. If things were reverse engineered from Lionel's perspective, he was able to deduce the connection between the Umbra and the cult by virtue of Radley's reactions. Radley's appearance couldn't have been a coincidence. That was the first flag. Him being so interested in Balthorn was a second flag. It smelled of keeping friends close and enemies closer. Then him finding a way to enter the Valiant Zone despite it exposing his true talent was the third. In the end, there were only two conclusions. Either the Umbra family was a rival of the cult, aiming for the same goal, or they were a piece that had broken off from them that just happened to share the same knowledge on this particular mission. Considering how weak the Umbra family was on the surface, the first option was highly unlikely considering this was a cult Lionel's own father took seriously. In the end, that just left the second deduction. However, Xylem didn't need to know the truth behind how Lionel made these deductions. Any holes in this new chain of reasoning Lionel was presenting could be explained away by saying the silver disc told him. So now, as you can see, Head Umbra, we share the same goal. You need to grow stronger to face the inevitable day the cult finds you, while I want to burn them all to ash. We stand on the same side, don't you think? Lionel's smile remained, but all Xylem could seem to see was a devil in sheep's clothing. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, with all of that out of the way, I'll ask you again. What do you think about me releasing you now? Chapter 1088. Time passed, and it wasn't long before Lionel was all alone within the segmented cube. Well, alone if Vice, Candle and Little Blackstar were ignored. As for Xylem, he had left after recollecting himself, realizing that he and his family didn't quite have much of a choice in the matter. Life worked in quite mysterious ways, honestly. Lionel had initially wanted to target the Radix and Midas families in order to complete the Silver Empire's legacy, but he actually ended up gaining the Umbra family instead. Of course, it was a chess piece that he couldn't use quite yet, but it was one nonetheless. Having them would make things interesting. As of right this moment, though, Lionel wasn't really concerned about such matters. Even now, with how real everything had suddenly gotten, it felt like a distant future. Instead, he was spending some time with Little Blackstar, trying to figure out exactly how the little guy had changed. Raising the little mink by his armpits, Lionel looked into Blackstar's deep black eyes. The little mink's long whiskers twitched as though to show his dissatisfaction toward being treated like a baby. Toward this, Lionel could only laugh. You're only 3 or 4 years old this year, right? You are a baby. Yip. Little Blackstar protested. Yip. Yip. Lionel, who could feel Blackstar's meaning through their connection, almost choked on air. Did he gain another little pervert for his group? Why was this little guy saying such vulgar things? Look at you being so boastful. What are you so proud about? The both of us are virgins. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, YP. Blackstar tried to claw at Lionel's face, but he only burst into a fit of laughter. Lionel was quite surprised at the little guy's strength, though. It was only a casual swipe of the paw, yet the wind pressure made Lionel's face sting a little bit. For Lionel to even feel anything he didn't want to feel was a tall task considering his body had been forcefully raised to Tier 9 recently, let alone for him to feel pain. Yet, not only had Little Blackstar done exactly that, the little mink hadn't even tried very hard. With a single look, Lionel could tell that Little Blackstar's dimensional grade hadn't budged a single inch. The little guy was still in the first tier of the 5th dimension. And yet, his power had actually undergone such a qualitative change. Lionel's smile beamed. He would have to remember to thank Kira when they met again. He had a feeling that they most definitely would at some point. Little Blackstar hopped up to his favorite perch atop Lionel's head as Lionel himself turned toward Vice and Candle. Thank you two for helping me out. Candle immediately turned flustered. Someone without context might think she was a girl in love, but Lionel knew enough to understand that Candle's mind hadn't even matured enough to give breath to such emotion. She was functionally still a child, as was Vice. In truth, the more time he spent with them, the more guilty he felt treating them like he did. Visit. For a better user experience ultimately, no matter what predispositions the two had, they were still human. Locking them away and rearing them like cattle, while only releasing them when they were useful to him. It truly didn't sit well with Lionel. Lionel sighed. If he released the reins on them, their power would grow far too quickly. Lionel took a deep breath and looked up into the skies. Finally, he made a decision. I've treated the two of you poorly. You may not understand enough about the world to understand this, but the fact that I know it is enough. I hope to treat you both the same as I do my brothers. I will trust you two so long as you don't give me a reason to doubt you. Candle and Vice both blinked, clearly not quite understanding Lionel's words. Even concepts like freedom and free will were foreign to them, let alone terms like family and brother. However, Lionel had expected as much and chose to take things slowly. He realized at that moment, if he wanted to unite the dimensional verse, was he just going to avoid all the savants to ever be born? There were most definitely powers out there that used savants like their own hidden trump cards. Would he just have to leave those powers alone? Of course not. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Was he willing to give up his dream then? After all, how could a normal human possibly defeat a savant? But the answer was the same, of course not. In that case, why was he so scared of the two savants by his side? If he couldn't outpace their growth, if he couldn't subdue them with his own strength, what right did he even have to think of conquering the dimensional verse? Having made such a decision, Lionel suddenly felt lighter. His king's might involuntarily wafted out from him, growing thicker as the color of his pale violet irises deepened before cooling back down to their original shade. Without much hesitation, Lionel reached out into thin air, causing a snow globe to appear in his hands. With a thought, Monkey's body appeared in the training arena, blood beginning to ceaselessly pool out from his wounds. The expressions of Candle and Vice changed. They both remembered this man, though his face was greatly disfigured at the moment. However, before they could understand what it was Lionel was trying to do, Monkey's vocal cords finally healed back into place. The moment they did, an enraged roar shook the segmented cube, causing Lionel to shake his head and sigh. He had wanted to give Monkey a chance at the same deal Vice and Candle gained as well, but it seemed that this wouldn't be possible. I will still give it a shot. Lionel's oppressive aura bore down, locking onto Monkey's every action. However, the latter had seemingly grown feral. Before Lionel could understand what was happening, his expression warped. Visit for a better user experience. Chapter 1089. Monkey began to wither away, his roars growing fainter. Lionel was stunned as he reached forward, but everything happened too quickly. Soon, what was left of Monkey became nothing more than a pile of ash, leaving Lionel absolutely baffled. What the hell just happened here? Little Blackstar jumped into action without waiting for Lionel's command, snagging a shadow out of the air before returning. However, Lionel hardly registered the little guy's actions. Lionel's brow furrowed tightly, his emotions whirling about and his mind in a fog. He had truly wanted to give Monkey a chance, and it was most definitely not his own action that caused the latter to end up like that. Lionel hadn't been shocked that Monkey was roaring in rage. It made sense. The last time they met, he was battling Lionel. If Lionel blamed him for this, it wouldn't have been fair. That was why Lionel was still willing to try and calm him down first. But reality was both cruel and unexpected. Lionel had no idea what could have happened to cause this, but he was left completely in shock, unable to speak a single word for a long while. The reason for this was simple. For the first time in his life, he had no explanation for what was before him. There was no spark in his dreamscape, no small clue he could grasp on, no immaculate, God-level deduction to make. There was simply nothing. The snow globe should have preserved Monkey in an absolutely perfect state. The only plausible explanation seemed to be that Monkey had run to the end of his ability and didn't have any more strength to duplicate his cells and heal himself anymore. But the snow globe should have frozen that process entirely. That left only one possibility. Whatever caused this had to have happened before Lionel put Monkey in the snow globe. But this possibility seemed even more impossible than the first. After several minutes, Lionel couldn't find a reason, nor could he find any clues. Without a choice, he closed his eyes, sighing deeply. Someone was toying with him. And he didn't like it one bit. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. This is it, Leo? This thing is disgusting. Alan, aside from being obsessed with a physique he hid beneath baggy clothes, was also the well-known clean freak of the group. Seeing the disgusting tentacle womb before him, despite the fact it was behind a thick wall of glass, he still couldn't help but gag as though he could smell it from here. Lionel chuckled. It's pretty useless the way it is now, but it has potential. You're thinking of using that hell spore on it, huh? I actually don't know quite yet. Remember Little Black Star's ability? I have something much better for it to absorb now. Alan blinked before he nodded in understanding. Then you want me to? You're probably the only one who's smart enough to manage this. If I leave it to the others, they'll probably find this thing dead by the time I return. Are you calling me dumb, Cap? Where's the workers' union? I want to propose a strike. Franco yelled out in indignation. Alan, however, seemed to hear something completely different. You're leaving? Nope. Lionel shook his head. I actually plan on managing the tentacle womb myself. It's just that I've realized that I've left you all in the dark about too many things until now. In fact, you all don't even know what my goal is, even though you likely know me well enough to have guessed by now. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Lionel suddenly felt a strong arm envelop his shoulder. He looked to the side and up to find Raj's big-faced grin looking back at him. Tell us, Cap. How much of it are we conquering? Lionel saw 8 pairs of eyes looking back at him, each one with their own level of fervor. He couldn't help but grin himself. As expected, it seemed like he didn't have to say a single word. All of it. Lionel strolled through the imperial capital, his steps not very hurried as he looked around. This was probably the first time he came while also having the time to leisurely stroll around. The war couldn't technically be considered over, as there were still several skirmishes still ongoing on the border of Earth's territory. But from what it looked like, it didn't seem that they would be ending anytime soon. Those individuals wouldn't stop until Earth simply grew too powerful for them to even dare. But with the current state of things, it would definitely take some time before they got there. Lionel eventually made it to the Imperial Palace, and the guards were still as stiff as they always were. But Lionel just ignored them as he usually did. The difference was that this time, none of them reached out to stop him. At the large arching doorways, Lionel's uncle Galerin already stood waiting, still wearing his spectacles as always. This man always seemed to be quite rigid. You're on time. Galerin spoke. Though his voice was quite even, he seemed to have been trying to convey surprise. Clearly he didn't expect this out of Lionel. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Punctuality is the foundation of any man. Galeron's brows shot up this time. He looked toward Lionel deeply, a hint of something else in his eye. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. I heard that you're on better terms with my son? Lionel grinned. Are you scared it'll steal him away from the Empire? Tiki. Galerin stopped himself, realizing he was sinking into Lionel's rhythm. This was something that usually only happened to him when he spoke with his father or when he spoke with his brother-in-law. To think. Galerin shook his head. Come with me. Soon, the pair had entered a familiar garden, and Lionel laid eyes on a man who was now much younger than he remembered him. But he didn't think much of it. There were probably odd twists and turns around this that he wasn't quite aware of, and didn't quite matter for now. Emperor Fox opened his eyes and looked Lionel up and down. The two remained in silence for a long while before he spoke. Not bad. You're not bad either, Lionel replied. Too bad you're a mass murderer. Galeron's brow furrowed, but Emperor Fox just laughed. I have a feeling that the blood on your hands will be much denser than mine when all is said and done. That is the difference between a king and an emperor. You can't escape that reality. Lionel's gaze narrowed, but he remained silent. This aside, your mother has contacted me. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, she's waiting for you and Noah on planet Luxnix. Feel free to go over whenever. I have to say, I'm quite eager to watch this play out. Chapter 1090. Lionel didn't react immediately to this news. On the inside, he was quite excited to see his mother. But, on the other hand, he had several questions he wanted to know the answer of first. The first and most obvious was why his mother had left him in the first place. There were too many things about his family dynamics that he couldn't quite grasp. First, there was the oddity of the fact he hadn't even known Emperor Fox was his grandfather until just a few years ago. Of course, Lionel knew that that was somewhat related to his status as someone who should have been imprisoned in Dark Cloud Prison, but that only made things more confusing to him. Was he really such a menace to society? Just how accurate was that test if it could only possibly read a fraction of his real DNA? But then there was the question of just how Earth's empire had become tied to one of the three leading families of this sector. How had his grandfather even met his grandmother to begin with? How had their relationship even taken root? His grandfather was maybe the greatest mystery of all of this. On first inspection, he seemed to be weak. After all, he had gotten old. From what Lionel knew, there had only ever been one emperor of the Ascension Empire, and that was this man before him. Thanks to Earth's technology, or what seemed like it, he had been able to live for more than 200 years, making it to the 25th century. However, things didn't really add up. He had enough strength to slap a fifth-dimensional existence like Scythe to death years ago, yet he couldn't maintain his youth? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, several small inconsistencies like these made Lionel shake his head. Practically, a weak man would never be able to win over a woman from a sixth-dimensional family. Unless. Lionel looked his grandfather up and down. Are you a drafted son-in-law? Galerin choked on air. He bent over, gasping and wheezing. A drafted son-in-law was probably the most humiliating position a man could be in. It was a situation where instead of a wife marrying into her husband's family and sharing his family name, the vice versa occurred. In this case, the man would take on the wife's family name and become a part of her family. Traditionally speaking, it was always the son's duty to carry on the family name while it was the daughter's duty to birth the lineage of the man she married. Even with how progressive 25th century Earth had become, this was still the default order of things. To insinuate the Emperor of Earth was a drafted son-in-law was an insult probably only short of saying the Ascension Empire would fall. Even the guards hidden in the surroundings, tasked with protecting Emperor Fox's safety, couldn't help but falter. Lionel, though, felt that it was plausible. Maybe the Luxniks wanted a piece of Earth but couldn't get it through normal means due to various reasons. This could have been a compromise between them and Emperor Fox. Who knows, maybe it's because of the secret help of the Luxniks that his grandfather was able to rise to power. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience on top of this, the help of the Luxniks would become very important very soon. As quickly as Earth had managed to enter the fifth dimension, they would likely speed run into the sixth as well. In that sort of situation, without the backing of a well-established and powerful sixth-dimensional power, Earth's luck would finally run out. The higher the dimension, the harder it was for talent to bridge the gap. If his grandfather made such a sacrifice, it would seem like truly the most logical decision. For the first time, Emperor Fox was truly speechless. He gazed at Lionel as though trying to gauge something, but in the end he just shook his head. I would teach you a lesson for that mouth of yours, but then your mother would start nagging me again. Emperor Fox continued to shake his head. I plan to tell you some things, but since you want to be so cheeky, how about you go find out for yourself? Lionel's placid expression spread into a smile. Sure, but where are my rewards? Rewards? Emperor Fox smoothed out his immaculately sculpted beard. For what exactly? Now it was Lionel's turn to be speechless. Did one have to be thick-skinned to be an emperor? Hey uncle, are you hearing this? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Galerin, who was still choking on his own air, coughed lightly, straightening out his back. His eyes flickered as he remembered Lionel's teasing words from earlier. Hear what? He asked with as straight a face as possible. I see how is. I guess I'll just have to tell the whole of Earth just how ungrateful Emperor Fox is. I'm currently a hero of heroes. I'm sure there'll be plenty of people willing to heed my call. Lionel cleared his voice as though he would truly begin to opine on his hardships. Both Emperor Fox and Galerin remained silent, light smiles tugging at their lips. It was clear that they weren't afraid of Lionel in the slightest. Plus, it wasn't as if anyone would hear anything even if he began shouting here. This was the Emperor's private garden. As if sound could casually travel outward. Seeing their lack of a reaction, Lionel realized that his tactic wouldn't work, at least not as presently constructed. Oh, I see. Got it. Lionel's smile became thinner. I guess when I see my mother for the first time in over a decade, and her heart is overflowing with warmth and the motherly instinct to protect, I'll just have to let her know that her father and her brother have taken advantage of her son. While her precious baby was on the front lines, putting his life on the line, they were resting in a cozy palace doing visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience moments later, Lionel walked out of the palace with a wide grin on his face, tossing a 12-sided star pendant up and down, his visage the picture of satisfaction. Just one more chapter coming for today. Chapter 1091. Imperial Father, you. Galerin looked toward where Lionel had vanished with a complicated look in his eye. This pair of grandson and grandfather really didn't like to take any losses. At this moment he actually felt a little bit bad for Lionel. If things had gone normally, Lionel might have still gotten a little something out of them. But it was a little bit much. Emperor Fox, after making sure that Lionel was gone, burst into a fit of laughter. He laughed harder than he had in a very long time, what remained of his wrinkles seemingly fading away with every peal of laughter. It took several moments for him to calm down, his move having been lifted by several levels. Who asked that brat to be so cheeky? Since he wanted a reward, I gave him a reward. But Galeron's gaze flickered. The reward Lionel had gotten was a pendant of the Luxnix family. It was one you received for granting a great service to the family and held just as much, if not more, weight that the imperial pendant Lionel had received from his grandfather in the past. The difference here was that one granted you the favor of a world like Earth that was ultimately still weak. However, the other granted you the favor of a family at the very pinnacle of the sixth dimension. Ultimately, the vaults of the latter were far more valuable. At least on the surface, anyway. Visit. For a better user experience, the star pendant, when exchanged with the Luxnix family, would give one the ability to freely pick out a treasure from the Luxnix family treasury. The ability to pick out a single reward might seem stingy, but the truth was exactly very much the opposite of this. As one of the three most powerful families of the sector, the treasures the Luxnix had monopolized were beyond one's wildest imaginations, at least from the lens of a fifth-dimensional world and below, even in the eyes of many sixth-dimensional existences as well. But it was exactly because of this that the snowy star pendant was more like a ticking time bomb than a reward. It only made it worse that the reward was originally given to Emperor Fox to begin with. Emperor Fox was dying of laughter because he could already imagine Lionel's face when he realized that his reward wouldn't be so easy to cash in. What are you so worried about? Eleanor is there. It was only after hearing this that Galerin realized that things would be all right, and it allowed him to settle down the weight on his heart. It seemed that he had long since given up on his own mother's backbone. Only in this way could he feel that his son would be safe. As for Lionel, that cheeky brat could use a few beatings. However, there was one thing still weighing on Galerin. Imperial Father, the service you rendered to earn that pendant. Emperor Fox waved a hand. I don't need a single thing from that family. They can consider themselves lucky that I haven't razed them to the ground yet. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Galerin fell into silence as Emperor Fox closed his eyes. A gentle wind passed by, washing the weight of their words away. Lionel had no idea that his grandfather had still had a trick up his sleeve. Currently, he was still blind about a lot of things and wasn't even aware, just yet, that the Luxnix family estate was potentially hostile ground. Oblivious, Lionel rounded up his brothers and contacted Noah. It wasn't long before the group of them had set off to a journey across the stars. In a somewhat unexpected twist, Lionel ended up taking more people along than he thought would be involved to begin with. It wasn't just Noah, but he also brought along Jessica. Along with the two of them, several other talents of Earth including the people of the Moon followed along as well. In fact, there was even Arthur's son Leonis. It hadn't been long since Lionel saw Leonis as they had fought together on Earth X1. But in an odd twist of fate, Lionel ended up being closer to Leonis' father and his big sister by several decades than he was to Leonis himself despite their ages being so close. The world worked in odd ways indeed. Seeing so many people, Lionel realized that he was definitely missing a large piece of this story. Whatever was going on at Planet Luxnix was definitely far more important than it seemed. He thought he was just going to see his mother, but things clearly weren't so simple. Still, Lionel welcomed them all with open arms. Since they were headed to a sixth-dimensional world, there would definitely be a lot of chances to grow stronger. Why wouldn't he want the people of Earth to benefit from this? After learning about the Three-Finger Cult, Lionel realized that there were far more claws sunk into not just the Milky Way, but the dimensional verse as a whole. None of them had the luxury of growing up slowly. Visit. For a better user experience as was natural, the men and women split, and the rowdiness of Lionel's brothers came into full effect. Noah, who was clearly not used to such situation, stood out like a sore thumb. No really. I was a fan. Carolus tried to hide a bit of his embarrassment. It's just that we didn't tend toward playing football on the moon, because our bones are more fragile than yours. We were too prone to injury, so I could only watch. Milan burst into a fit of laughter. You hear that, Cap? I have a fanboy. Who's a fan of you? I've never heard of someone tripping over themselves to praise a position as boring as yours. Raj snapped. Clearly he's infatuated with my elegant blocking. Piss off. There's nothing elegant about people crashing into that jiggling stomach of yours. It's called insulation, you uncultured swine. In the eyes of Mother Nature, I have an evolutionary advantage over you. Good luck in the long, cold winters. The rowdiness of the group only grew as the days passed. Not long later, the rotating orbit of 3 planets that couldn't have been more different from one another appeared before them. However, it was difficult to enjoy the beautiful sights at all because the densely packed starways of spaceships clogged up the view. What the fuck? Raj exclaimed. There's traffic in space too? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience. Chapter 1092. The sight was a bit overwhelming. To many of the youths here, the wider dimensional verse was still new to them. Back on Earth, before the metamorphosis, though technology had been very high level, space exploration was still something that had numerous sanctions and holds. Something like seeing a large army of spaceships was beyond their scope of experiences. It only made things worse that of all the galaxies in this sector, the Milky Way was practically considered to be bumpkin country. There were many planets, worlds and organizations that remained fairly restricted, and rarely allowed interplanetary travel. The population of spacecraft owners was a small enough percentage of the larger picture that this was the very first time any of them had seen such a scene, including Lionel. This being the first time they were in such a situation. Even Lionel felt at a loss for a moment. But after quickly analyzing the situation, he grasped a general understanding. The starways were essentially just motes of light that guided the spacecrafts toward their destinations. It was hard to tell exactly which to choose, not because Lionel couldn't tell which roads went where, but rather because each of the planets had hundreds of starways to choose from. The trouble was that Lionel only knew which of the 3 planets was Planet Luxnix. He didn't really have any other information. Without a choice, he could only pick out a random starway and follow it, falling into line along with everyone else. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. While the segmented cube was in a state of cruising, it was no issue for everyone to be within the same region. Lionel, who was still monitoring the overall situation, almost didn't notice that after Raj's initial outburst, the atmosphere had become quite silent. Lionel took his gaze away from the starway and swept it over everyone. At the moment, they were all in a dining room of the abode setting, supposed to be enjoying a cross of the beautiful scenery of space, camaraderie and the food spread. However, instead of this, many of them had furrowed brows. Some had more serious expressions than others, and some were clearly more comfortable. But there was no doubt that the vast majority seemed to be going through an adjustment period. The only one who didn't seem affected at all was Lionel's cousin, Noah. But then again, his face was always that serious, so it was hard to tell. It was only then that Lionel remembered that they had just stepped through a fifth-dimensional fold to enter a sixth-dimensional one. At the same time, the pressure here was far beyond any normal sixth-dimensional fold of reality. If it was normal, why would three such powerful families be forced to share it together? Logic dictated that they had probably warred over this region in the past, and ended up settling for ruling over it together when neither could get an upper hand. As such, it wasn't a large leap to believe that this was the most beneficial location of this sector to all three families. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience seeing through the issue, Lionel chose to slow the segmented cube even further, allowing everyone the time they needed to get acclimated properly. If they didn't even feel comfortable in their own bodies, whatever danger they may or may not face would only become all the more so. Lionel, who had still never experienced such a dissonance upon entering a higher dimension, could only believe that it must have to do with his parents. Noah's lack of a reaction would seem to back this up as well. To Noah, coming to Luxnix should have been no different from returning to Earth. Both worlds should recognize him as one of their own. Due to the slowing of the place, it took the group several hours before they finally approached the planet. But the good news was that everyone's furrowed brows seemed to have relaxed immensely by this point, and the banter seemed to have come back. It seems that there are some fast-track starways around too. I don't feel very comfortable claiming to be a Luxnix before I understand the situation of the family first, so it might not be too good to use them for now, but I'll keep it in mind for the future. Lionel was too used to entering and leaving planets on a whim. He hadn't even realized that this was a product of just how far behind the Milky Way was in comparison to other galaxies in the sector. He would definitely have to be more thoughtful in the future, lest he stir up trouble he wouldn't be able to handle. At that moment, the segmented cube rumbled, touching down through planet Luxnix's atmosphere. The slight shake caused everyone's gaze to light up. It seemed that they would finally touch down soon. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, the speed of the spacecrafts accelerated, swooping down and finding a familiar large hive of parking spaces. It was only at that moment that Lionel realized another problem. He didn't like the idea of leaving the segmented cube parked here. It was far too important to him. But at the same time, it was kind of odd to swoop down in a spaceship that suddenly vanished as well, especially considering how it seemed bureaucracy would get involved very soon. Once again, the simplest thing to do seemed to be to rely on the Luxnix family name. He would even have the pendant to prove it if somehow his own lineage factor wasn't enough. But the idea once again didn't sound very palatable to Lionel. Before Lionel could come to a decision, his segmented cube was led to a hub of the spacecraft hive. From the outside, it had once again taken the form of a cube, but this wasn't too surprising to anyone as there were all sorts of odd spaceship designs all around. When Aina had touched down with Yuri and Savon, her father had been waiting. Unfortunately for Lionel, when he touched down, rather than finding his mother, he found a middle-aged man with glasses riding his high-bridged nose, wearing a tight suit, and holding what looked like a clipboard made of transparent glass. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. He stared coldly at the cube, clearly waiting for someone to step out. Lionel stood to go, but he surprisingly found Noah's hand on his shoulder. "I'll go." Chapter 1093. Lionel found Noah's actions to be amusing. It was clear that Noah was a lot more sensitive to trouble Lionel might cause if he went instead, so he chose to bite the bullet. Toward such a thing, Lionel's 8 brothers laughed until they couldn't breathe anymore. "Look at that, Cap, someone else notices all the trouble you put us through." Franco almost fell out his chair. "If anyone was going to cause us trouble, it'd be that big mouth of yours." Lionel snapped back. "Not cool, Cap, poking at your boy's insecurities. No wonder Noah doesn't trust you." Franco feigned hurt, his overly large hands also pressing against his chest. But no one could take him seriously while he was wheezing with laughter. Since he seemed to be having such a great time, Lionel kicked at the leg of his chair, causing him to truly fall over completely. "Ah, I swear I'll make a workers' union. By then you won't be able to bully me anymore." The laughter in the dining room continued for a while. However, as the minutes passed, it became clear that it was actually taking Noah quite a while. In fact, it wasn't until half an hour later that he finally returned, his expression just as placid as ever. Visit. For a better user experience, what happened, Noah? Everyone looked over. They might have been able to tell a problem or the good news by another's expression. But Noah was truly too difficult to read. There's a lot to do because we've brought so many people along with us. However, it seems that due to some special event occurring, the restrictions on travelers has been laxed. That said, there's still a bunch of requirements we have to meet. We all have to register, and it's fairly detailed. Noah began to pass out what everyone assumed would facilitate the registration process. But when they all saw just how detailed the analysis had to be, they couldn't help but frown. It had to be remembered that in the dimensional verse, the less information others had of you, the easier it was for you to protect yourself. But this form of analysis was clearly overly invasive. It even required information about their ability indexes, something most kept as close to the vest as possible. They couldn't help but feel that Planet Luxnix was taking advantage of them all. Lionel, though, saw one step deeper. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. There were so many spacecrafts flying into Planet Luxnix, and now Noah was mentioning this special event. Connecting the dots, it felt like the Luxnix were using this opportunity to form a census of the people of their sector. Lionel couldn't be surprised if this information was used to gain a general understanding of the strength of the sector. Unfortunately, they didn't really have much of a choice. At least that was what it seemed like until Noah continued talking. After speaking with our overseer, I realized that there was a bit of a loophole here. Because Lionel and I both carry Luxnix blood, I believe we'll be recognized as members of the Luxnix branch families. So long as you all register as our vassals, it should be possible to circumvent a lot of the more invasive questions and leave them with only a surface-level understanding of you all. But the decision is up to you all. Oh, since it's like that, why didn't you just say so? You made it sound like I'd have to give up my precious cherry. Raj exclaimed. Several weird looks were sent over toward Raj, their expressions warping. Precious cherry? What are you all looking at? My body is a temple. Raj's speech was so impassioned that the jiggles of his chin vibrated to their own rhythm. Unfortunately for him, his opining was matched with the sound of dry heaving. Visit. For a better user experience, I think I'm gonna throw up. Hey Franco, cup your hands together for me real quick. Gil heaved, only to be met by a slap to the back of the head by none other than Franco himself. Noah blinked as he watched this scene, feeling somewhat stunned. He had presented this matter with the utmost seriousness because it most definitely wasn't a joke. It might have sounded nice to explain it away with a word like vassal, but the ultimate truth was that for the duration of their stay on Planet Luxnix, they would essentially be at the whims of Lionel and Noah. There were no such thing as human rights in the dimensional verse. There was only those with strength and those without, those with background and those without. If they signed up in this fashion, their lives and deaths would be in the hands of the two of them. The amount of trust it would take for someone to take such measures without hesitation. Noah's expression remained placid, but he couldn't help but be moved. Unlike many princes, he had never experienced the cruelty of nobility, not personally, anyway. The Fox family had never had internal machinations, at least not at the highest levels. So, things like brothers backstabbing brothers wasn't part of Noah's lived experience. That said, Noah's upbringing had still been extremely strict, and he had seen exactly this sort of cruelty in the royal court and other noble families countless times. He always followed the rules to their ends, but he was also perfectly aware that he couldn't expect everyone to be like him either. On top of this, due to Noah's status, he didn't really know what it felt like to have real friends either. He didn't get the chance to grow up with his cousin by his side, and everyone else was either his subordinate or someone who wanted to get close to him for the sake of the power he wielded. Understanding Noah's perspective, it was no wonder he was so shocked right now. At the very least, Lionel's 8 brothers didn't hesitate in the slightest to jump head first into acceptance. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Leonis looked toward Noah with a knowing smile. Of all those here, he probably had experienced the life most like Noah. It seemed that they both had some growing to do. Chapter 1094. An hour later, the overseer returned to the parking hub, but his stoic expression could only be replaced with shock. He looked around, but he couldn't seem to find the spacecraft that had been here anywhere. Weird. Did they leave? No, that's impossible. The overseer's brow furrowed. Maybe it's a concealment formation? Those are pretty popular these days. Checking his glass clipboard, the overseer saw that this party was led by 2 Luxnix branch family members. In fact, judging by the density of their blood, they should be ranked quite highly amongst the branches as well. So he was more than willing to overlook some things. That wasn't the only reason the overseer was impressed either. They actually brought more than 50 people along with them. Any branch with this density of talents is definitely very highly rated. It's best that I know my place and don't pry into their business too much. After nodding to himself, the overseer opened a hidden panel to the side and pressed a few buttons. Soon, the parking hive screen began to descend, moving just slowly enough for the overseer to slip out and move toward the next waiting group. Visit. For a better user experience, the Horde of Earth's talents had had dreams of living it up on this new planet, and finally exploring a 6th-dimensional world for the first time. Unfortunately, reality was like a cruel slap in the face. Fuck. We're so poor. Gil was by far the most heartbroken. He could only look at the pretty women through the large glass windows, knowing that he didn't have the money he needed to even take a single step in. They were all swiftly met with the disparity between 5th and 6th dimensional worlds. There wasn't a restaurant, a boutique, or even an inn in sight that didn't use 6th dimensional herb or as the common denomination. In fact, Planet Luxnix preferred the use of a purple coin that was recognized throughout the 3 families. You could exchange herb ore for these coins, but it took 10 kilograms of 6th-dimensional herb ore to exchange for a cents purple coin. The only 6th-dimension herb ore Lionel had on hand came from what he plundered from Belize, Averone, Dolores and Cirrus, but they could only be considered mid-level 6th-dimensional powerhouses. Even between the 4 of them, Lionel only managed to gather 50,000 kilograms, which was only enough for 5,000 purple coins. Even the lowest prices Lionel had seen just casually glancing through these windows had cost dozens of purple coins. He most definitely couldn't support more than 50 people to experience this planet in leisure. In fact, with how things were going, they might have to sleep in the wilderness tonight. Luckily, before things got that bad, Noah came to the rescue. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, there are some special accommodations for Luxnix family branch members that we can go to. I didn't think that we'd need them so soon. But judging by the situation, Noah blushed slightly. Clearly, he was a bit off on his assessment of his own wealth as well. Lionel couldn't help but laugh seeing Noah's state. It was rare to see him shift from his baseline coldness. He couldn't help but wrap his arm around his shoulder. That old codger is too stingy. Lionel sighed and shook his head. Noah choked on air. Old codger? You mean grandfather? That. Noah didn't know how to react. He had never heard anyone say such things about his grandfather before. But then again, he was Lionel's grandfather too. What was the appropriate response to this? Noah suddenly found that he didn't have a diplomatic solution to this at all. But that only made Lionel laugh harder. Come, since we're so poor we might as well check out these accommodations. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel felt that they didn't really have a choice. He didn't really want to rely on the Luxnix without understanding the situation. But technically, both Noah and Lionel were actually members of the main branch. After all, his grandmother should be an elder of the main branch, so her lineage would of course receive like treatment. So technically, Lionel was already taking several steps back by only accepting the accommodation of a branch family member. That said, Lionel obviously had no idea that his name was stricken from the family records. If he had known this, his attitude wouldn't have been nearly as casual. The accommodations for the branch family members of the Luxniks were truly not bad. Though it wasn't near the Luxniks family estate, it had its own unique character. Well, as much character as a series of enormous buildings could have. Just at a single glance, it was possible to tell that the Luxniks had set aside a series of luxury hotels for their extended family members. The only unfortunate part was that the congestion at the front made everything that much harder to appreciate. Do you know who I am? I'm heading the younger generation of the Nipso branch. We've contributed so much to the main branch over the years. Now you want to give us such normal accommodations? Piss off. What fucking Nipso branch? I've never seen your names in even the top 10 of the branch contribution rankings. What have you been doing? Conquering little fifth-dimensional worlds? Maybe you aren't even doing that. Are you taking their moons and calling it a day? What right do you have to a penthouse suite? There are only 10 of them. How about you go take a look in the mirror? The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. You haven't seen us in the top 10. Do you need your eyes checked? I've seen your Conlon branch barely holding on at the 12th spot. Maybe your eyes can't look up so high. Imagine looking at the daily rankings and thinking you're something special. We of the Nipso branch only care about the yearly rankings. It's just that we've taken some time off recently to prepare for this event. Arguments of a similar nature seemed to be erupting all around as swarms of people fought back and forth. But it was quite obvious at first glance to Lionel that while they were rowdy, none of them had stepped over the red ropes that separated them from the experts waiting to assign their rooms. However, these experts didn't seem to be willing to make a move either. What a shit show. Lionel was speechless. Chapter 1095. The ruckus had reached such a ridiculous level that no one even really noticed the arrival of as many as 50 people. That was more than enough to paint the picture of not only just how large the group was to begin with, but how invested they were in causing trouble. Just from eavesdropping a few arguments, Lionel was able to tell what the main issue was. There were several large hotel-style buildings up ahead. These hotels were surrounded by lush gardens, various sports fields, dining regions, and other places of leisure. But it seemed that the most hotly contested regions were within the hotels themselves. There were exactly 10 of these hotel buildings, and it seemed like each family was scrambling for a penthouse suite. The problem was not just that there were more than 10 branch families, but a single penthouse could only room so many people to begin with. Just by counting the windows from the outside and judging by the height and thickness of the buildings, Lionel realized that the problem was more than just the penthouse, and it seemed that many hadn't realized this just yet. There were 10 hotels, and by Lionel's calculations, each had about 200 rooms. If the average was taken, each room could probably house between 2 to 3 people. Even if Lionel chose the upper limit, that was still only room for about 6,000 people. And if Lionel was honest, it was likely closer to 5,000. The trouble was that this crowd seemed to already have thousands of people in it. And this obviously didn't count whatever groups had arrived earlier than them all. After all, Lionel hadn't exactly left Earth on a timely schedule, so it was a bit much to expect that they would have been the first batch of arrivals. Visit. For a better user experience, that meant that there was a good chance that many of the rooms had already been accounted for. Yet these people were out here screaming like this would do something. There are screaming matches not only between branches, but there's even competition and internal struggle within branches themselves. Lionel shook his head. As far as he was concerned, this was a matter of life and death for himself and those he had brought with him. While they had joked about sleeping in the wilderness earlier, on a pinnacle sixth-dimensional world like this one, there was no telling what kind of dangers lay outside the breadth of the protected cities. Even now, the segmented cube couldn't be considered to be a fort, and it was very susceptible to being penetrated from the outside. It was relatively safer in a weaker dimensional world, as it had entered its third phase. But now that it was in a world of equivalent status, what advantage it had once had was now null. Lionel cast a glance toward Noah, and they both seemed to have come to the same conclusion. Quickly scanning the crowd, Lionel couldn't seem to find a way through. At the same time, there didn't seem to be any signs directing them in what to do. There was only a line of red rope blocking their further advancement. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. The two didn't act rashly. They could tell that there were plenty in the crowd who had also fallen silent, realizing their rowdiness wouldn't get them anywhere. Lionel initially wanted to ask for normal rooms, making it clear he would give up a fight for the penthouses for the sake of those around him, but he felt like if such a decision was possible, others would have made it already. There was something decidedly off about the current circumstances, and it felt more like people were waiting for a signal or a time of some sort. Understanding the situation that they were in, Lionel instead began to slowly analyze those around him. Now that he was in a sixth-dimensional world, he no longer dared to just casually release his internal sight as he did in the past, but the hit on his senses wasn't too profound. No one here is about the fifth dimension, but there are several well into the middle tiers. Lionel's expressions turned serious. He didn't dare to take fifth-dimensional existences above himself casually now. This was no longer the Milky Way or its surrounding galaxies. The power and talent of these people was on an entirely different level. The young man hollering about the Nipso branch had 3 silent youths to his back. In fact, he was the weakest of them all. He was tier 5, however of the 3 youths to his back, 2 were tier 6 and 1 was tier 7. The Conlon branch was comparable in strength. Likewise, the young man yelling was just tier 5, but there were 2 tier 6 existences to his back and 1 tier 7. Visit. For a better user experience right now, these 2 groups seemed to be the most powerful. But Lionel had found a silent young woman who stood almost completely by her lonesome. Her hair colored a red-gold flare, and her jaw was quite strong. Despite this, she still managed to keep her feminine charm. It only took a glance for Lionel to realize that she was actually tier 8. Seemingly feeling Lionel's gaze, the young woman turned her head, her twinkling irises matching Lionel. She looked him up and down without reserve before looking away. It seemed that she hadn't found anything particularly special. Right then, the silent overseers looked up into the sky. Seemingly deciding something, they chose to step forward. In the middle of them, a youth with sweeping white hair and piercing golden eyes took the helm. The aura he exuded seemed to silence any and all before him. Despite the fact he was only tier 4, he commanded an aura of absolute obedience and dominance. Today 50 rooms will be up for claiming. 30 will be 3-person rooms. 20 will be 2-person rooms. 9 will be 1-person rooms. 1 will be a penthouse suite. The rules will be the same as they've been. Only those with 0. 10 bloodline density and above can participate. You may fight for 1 or multiple rooms depending on your ability. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, those who will participate, step forward now. Chapter 1096. 0. 10 bloodline density. Lionel's gaze narrowed. He wasn't familiar with this form of measurement. But since things were like this, he had no choice but to hope he met the mark. He should be fine, but there was no real certainty. If things worked like they did on Earth, then Lionel would probably have 25% of whatever DNA would make a Luxnix be considered to be purebred. But something told Lionel that the lineage factors of the dimensional verse functioned differently. At the very least, he hoped Noah could meet the mark and claim a few rooms for them. The moment the youth spoke these words, several had ugly expressions, and this even included the 2 tier 5 youths who had been the loudest of the bunch. Soon, those who knew they would never make it began to move away from the red ropes, knowing their place. They don't meet the mark? But it seems they aren't moving away. Are they going to try their luck? This told Lionel one very simple thing. This bloodline density could be changed. If they were certain that it couldn't, they wouldn't even bother. You guys can take a step back as well. Noah and I've got this. Lionel gave the youths of Earth a reassuring grin. Even if it was hopeless, he would have to find a way to make it hopeful. He was only tier 1 now, a far cry from the other participants, but he didn't have much of a choice but to make sure this worked out. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience soon. There were only a few dozen people left of the thousands that had been at the ropes. Everyone else had given them a wide space at the base of the first hotel. There were hundreds of meters worth of perfectly paved stones in every which direction, making a single person seem particularly small. The Tier 4 youth representing the Luxnix took out a crystal ball he was forced to hold with 2 hands. It was a size larger than a normal human head and perfectly rounded. It was quite a beautiful construction. Its appearance seemed to remind Lionel of Camelot's crystal balls as well. It had been a long time since he thought of them, but he remembered being fascinated about just how they stored information. Maybe there's a lot more to Camelot's magic system that I've been ignoring. I wonder if it's possible to deduce the path of evolution their technology would have taken over time as well. As Lionel was lost in thought, the Tier 5 Nipso branch member stepped forward, seemingly wanting to get it over and done with as soon as possible. Compared to his previously rambunctious self, he seemed to become especially timid after crossing the red ropes to the other side. It was almost as though the difference between himself and the youths before him was palpable despite the fact he was technically a tier above the young man before him. The Tier 5 youth pressed his hand down on the sphere and took a deep breath. Then his body erupted with a white gold force, filling the crystal ball to the brim in the blink of an eye. The youth quickly removed his hand and took a step back, watching the crystal ball with anticipation, and his fists clenched. Soon, a pillar of light rose out from the crystal ball. Visit. For a better user experience, it shot past 1 and 2 feet quickly, blasting through 5 feet and soon crossing 7. However, the moment it reached that height, it began to slow considerably, barely crossing past 8 as it struggled forward. The forehead of the youth became covered in sweat, his hands clutching so tightly that even the blood he drew couldn't find a path to drip to the ground. The pillar rose past 9 feet finally, but every subsequent inch felt like scratching and clawing. Eventually, after rising up just 8 more inches, for from the 10-foot mark, it came to a grinding halt and released a pulse of light. 0.0967. Failed. The youth deflated in an instant, but he didn't protest. He knew better than to do something so foolish. At the very least, so long as his companions won an extra room, he would be priority in claiming it. 0.0963. Failed. The Tier 5 Conlin youth failed soon afterward. One after another, youths just barely missed the mark, whittling down the few dozen that had stayed behind to less than even a single dozen total. It was quite depressing to see one individual after another just barely miss the mark, but this was only to be expected. Only those who were close to begin with would even dare to take this test. At that moment, one of the Tier 6 Nipso branch youths stepped forward, carrying a level of confidence the others hadn't had. He bowed lightly in greeting to the 3 main branch youths. The latest _AP_SOTIs are on the website. Clyde Luxnix. He introduced himself. Not wasting any more time, he placed his hand on the crystal ball and his force surged. Before he even got a chance to step back, the pillar of light shot upward, beginning to climb faster and faster. This time, unlike it had with the others, the pillar didn't seem to slow in the slightest, bursting through 8, 9 and even 10 feet in the blink of an eye. 11 feet. 12. The pillar didn't begin to slow until the light crossed 15 feet. Soon, it crossed 16 before it slowed to a crawl and finally came to a grinding halt. 0.1623. Pass. Clyde's face lit up. Clearly, he was very much impressed with his own performance and felt like he was on cloud 9. However, he was soon hit with the reality that the youths before him didn't seem to care about his performance in the slightest. In fact, one of them, seeing how excited he was, couldn't help but turn a look of disdain his way. Clyde's excitement very quickly became embarrassment. Without a choice, he scurried back, unwilling to humiliate himself any further. The latest _AP_SOTIs are on the website. Soon, the second Tier 6 member of the Nipso branch stepped forward, their expression much more reserved after seeing what happened to their companion. All of them became keenly aware at that moment that they were nothing more than ants in the eyes of the main branch youths. Chapter 1097. 0.1783. Pass. 0.1812. Pass. 0.1405. Pass. The youths who came next no longer bothered to introduce themselves. The shame of Clyde still burned fiercely into their minds. None of them wanted to suffer through the same humiliation. Even without speaking a single word, these youths had made them feel as though they were less than trash. And yet, they could only clench their fists in silence, enduring. Lionel watched on without saying a word, his arms crossed about his chest. To his side, Noah stood just as expressionlessly. A slow building of an oppressive aura rose around the two of them, as neither seemed to be willing to make a move. As far as they were concerned, what they did wouldn't matter much. In the case that their bloodline density was enough to impress these three youths, then there would be no real point in doing anything. Their action would only reinforce the disdain these youths had for those of low bloodline density. Visit. For the best know_vel_read_ng experience in the case that their bloodline density didn't meet the mark and they fought against these youths, they would only be shooting themselves in the foot. They had no money and nowhere else to go, and this world was too dangerous to be taken casually. It was one thing if they only had to take care of themselves, but they had the safety of more than 50 other individuals to cover for. The young woman with red gold hair couldn't help but look over toward Lionel and Noah. Their auras were quite reserved, but she was a lot closer to them than the main branch youths were. As such, it was far easier for her to pick up on it. Her lips couldn't help but curl into a smile. The good was that they actually dared to still have a temper before these three youths. But the bad was far worse. What good was a temper if you were too weak to do anything about it? With the smile still tugging at her lips, she stepped forward. Raya Sage. She was the very first to introduce herself after Clyde. No, it was more accurate to say that she was the only one who dared to introduce herself after Clyde's humiliation. And what was even more astonishing was that her last name wasn't Luxnix. Clearly, she had taken her father's name. The boldness of this Raya girl couldn't be understated in the slightest. The Sage family was one only second to the Luxnix, Viola and Montex families. As such, it wasn't a humiliation for a woman of the Luxnix to marry into their family. The trouble was, if Raya had the support of the Sage family, why would she come here? Visit. For a better user experience, the only explanation was that she hadn't come for the sake of gaining a place of accommodation. She had come for no other reason than to test the Luxnix youths. She wasn't very interested in these regular branch members. She was far more intrigued with the youths in the penthouse, so she thought that she would claim one for herself. As for what the youths before her thought of that, she didn't really care. Technically, she was indeed a member of the Luxnix branch families. Without waiting for a response, she too put her hand on the crystal ball, her force surging. Her palm had hardly touched the smooth glass when the hidden force within stirred, waking up like slumbering dragons. The call of a bird cawed through the skies. In one moment, there was no pillar at all, and in the next, a beam of light over 30 feet tall manifested, still rocketing upward. The youth holding the crystal narrowed his gaze. The 30-foot mark demarcated a bloodline density of 0.30. That was already enough to match the lower-ranked members of the main branch. Every 10 feet could be considered a watershed moment. It was already impressive enough to cross the first watershed as a member of a branch family. Beyond 20 feet, and you could be considered a rare find among these branch families. These were individuals the main branch entrusted with tasks of great importance like managing valuable disaster worlds and other similar resources. Visit. For the best know_vel_read_ng experience, the 30-foot mark, though, was the baseline for being nurtured by the main branch. If such a youth was born in one of their branch families, so long as their background was clean and didn't involve any scandals, like bastard children and the like, they would be entered into the main family records. If one managed to cross the 40-foot mark, though, the pillar trembled, crossing the 39-foot mark before it finally began to slow down. As though it had met firm resistance, it pulsed wildly. However, ultimately, it couldn't cross the next threshold, finding itself stuck and unable to move on. Tisk. Raya shook her head. Shame a shame. 0.3989. Pass. The youth holding the crystal ball narrowed his gaze. This bloodline density was beyond his own, yet she didn't even share the Luxnix family name. Inwardly, he was more than just a small bit infuriated. However, with such bloodline density while being at tier 8, It was clear and obvious to him that he stood no chance against this woman. In addition, there was a good chance that since she chose the Sage family name despite having such thick Luxnix blood, that she was actually an extremely rare dual lineage factor wielder. Those that could maintain 2 high bloodline densities at a time were geniuses among geniuses. He didn't dare to mess with this girl whether her name was Luxnix or not. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Lionel smiled lightly as he watched this scene. But he still had no reference for how impressive this mark was, so he only watched on as Noah was forced to follow it up. In the end, there were only the 2 of them left. There wasn't much of a choice. Noah's expression carried not a hint of fluctuations as he stepped forward. Raya couldn't help but raise her brows. She had gone up before the 2 of them on purpose after seeing their obstinance, eager to see if their egos were just for show or not. But who knew that they wouldn't have reacted at all? However, her intrigue soon turned to shock the moment Noah placed his palm down. Chapter 1098. The cry was so loud that many were forced to cover their ears. What once had been a pillar of light for everyone else became a bird soaring into the skies. Every flap of its wings covered 10 feet without fail as it rose up. Raya's eyes widened when the bird tore through the 40-foot mark. Unlike Lionel and Noah, she knew exactly what this meant, as did the 3 youths of the main branch. Their expressions couldn't help but change. Bloodline density sounded like a very loose term, but there were actually very stringent markers to meet. These markers were designated by the number of lineage factor talents you had awakened, and what depth you had in each one of their branches. The Snowy Star Owl lineage factor had 3 main branches: speed, wisdom, and healing. Whether it was 0, 10, 0, 20, or even 0, 30, none guaranteed you an awakening of any one of these. These densities essentially decided what level of affinity you would have for Snow Force. If the metrics of Valiant Heart Mountain were used, 0. 10 would be about 3rd grade affinity, 0. 20 would be 6th grade, and finally 0. 30 would be 8th grade, while nearing 0. 40 would give you 9th grade. It had to be remembered that this was affinity for a very particular light elemental force in Snow Force. This wasn't the same as having a general light elemental affinity. Having 9th grade affinity for Snow Force was much different from having 9th grade affinity for light elemental force in general. However, 0. 40 was a different beast entirely. To have 0. 40 bloodline density meant that you had awakened at least one of the 3 main branches. This didn't just make you a genius, it made you one the Luxnix would nurture with everything they had. To awaken a branch of the Snowy Star Owl lineage factor, while not having reached the 6th dimension, yet was a rarity among rarities even in the main branch. The Tier 4 youth could count on both hands and feet the number of youths who met this mark, and that was in spite of the fact there were millions of members of the main branch and billions of the side branches. Seeing Noah cross the 40-foot mark, how could they not be shocked into silence? Lionel's gaze scanned the reactions of those around. When he saw how they were reacting, his lip curled into a smile. It seems that his cousin wasn't bad indeed. But what no one expected was for Noah's Snowy Star Owl illusion to continue, crossing the 50-foot mark before it even thought of slowing down. Visit. For a better user experience, the hands of the youth holding the crystal ball trembled. In the younger generation of the Luxnix family, there were only 3 youths who could cross the 50-foot mark. Actually, there were 4, but the 4th was such a lofty existence all to his own that everyone subconsciously set him apart from the others despite the fact he was technically a lot younger than most of them. Noah looked up into the skies, just as expressionlessly as always. His emerald irises reflected the light, but no real emotion. Unfortunately, the youths of Earth wouldn't allow him to continue acting cool. The sounds of whistling matched the call of the bird in the sky. Show them who's boss, Noah. Raj took off his shirt and revealed his temple to the world, waving it in the air like a pumped-up cheerleader. Whether by coincidence or not, the flapping folds of his fat matched the flaps of the illusory bird as it hovered in the air, looking down on everyone proudly. The cheering of Raj and the others tested the thickness of Noah's face. He could only pretend as though he didn't hear anything so that he could scurry off to the side. Lionel burst into laughter. walking forward and patting Noah's shoulder. The bird in the skies didn't seem to want to disperse. It was probably possible to spot it from several kilometers away. At the very least, those in the city most definitely all saw it, and couldn't help but look toward it in awe. Soon, the snowy star owl began to disperse, motes of light dancing about the air as they faded. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. The Tier 4 youth looked toward Noah with a narrowed gaze. Unlike Raya, Noah hadn't introduced himself. This made things kind of weird. Who are you? Which branch do you come from? Something like this had to be reported without a doubt. It likely wouldn't be long before this spread far and wide. How had such a talent not been brought into the main branch already? My name is Noah Fox. I don't come from any named branch family. The Tier 4 youth's brow furrowed. A bastard child? This conclusion was very likely. With how the dimensional verse worked, there were likely no shortage of illegitimate children out there for several Luxnix family elders. This made the situation very complicated. If Noah was the bastard child of a Star Order elder, it would be even more troublesome as it was a scandal the family wouldn't like at all. Purity was especially important for the Luxnix. The Tier 4 youth could only hope to end this all as quickly as possible so that he could go back to report this. He looked toward Lionel, a hint of impatience in his eye. However, seeing how close Noah and Lionel seemed to be, he didn't dare to be too dismissive at the same time. Lionel smiled lightly and took a step forward, placing his palm on the crystal. The difference was simply too striking. Whether it had been Noah or Raya, both gained a reaction that was instantaneous even without the deployment of their snow force. However, for Lionel, there was absolute silence. It made those around think that his result would be just as benign as those that came before Raya. Visit for the best no_vel_read_ng experience, but reality was very much different. In complete silence, the illusion of a snowy star owl appeared to Lionel's back. Its sharp gaze lingered in silence as everyone paid attention to the crystal ball. None seemed to notice that change until it was far too late. The crystal began to glow slowly, so slowly that it was agonizing. However, there was a difference between this time and any other time before it. The Tier 4 youth felt that his palms were melting. Crack! The sound was jarring, shaking many out of their lull. It was only then that the pair of eyes to Lionel's back seemed to enter their vision. Somehow, no matter whether you were facing Lionel's front or back, the pair continued to pierce through your very soul. The call of the bird followed, but it was neither loud nor grating. Rather, it became a sonorous call that touched the heart, filling every inch of planet Luxnix. There was not a single soul who didn't hear it. Right then, the crystal ball burst apart, releasing a blinding light that shot into the skies and pierced the clouds above. It continued for such a long and sweeping distance that it even tore a path out of planet Luxnix atmosphere, presenting a sight that could be seen even from planet Viola and Montex. Visit for a better user experience in a particular garden. An old woman slowly rocking her chair of whitewood looked into the skies. Her glazed-over gaze trembled slightly, her heart skipping a beat. She didn't need to be there to know that it was her grandson. Both of them. Chapter 1099. Lionel looked up into the skies. Even with the second stage of his wisdom branch activated, he couldn't see to the end of it. Of course, this so-called second stage were the eyes of the snowy star owl. In fact, Lionel had reached the second stage of both his wisdom branch and speed branch long ago. The star path that appeared when he hit his top speed was exactly the second stage of the speed branch, and his white-gold illusory wings. The only branch Lionel was still at the first stage for was the healing branch of his snowy star owl lineage factor, and it could only be used once every several months. It was precisely because these things had come so easily to Lionel that he wasn't aware of how he compared to the others of the Luxnix family. In fact, he took these awakened talents for granted so much so that he rarely used them in battle, often choosing to rely on his ability index much more than other things. This wasn't entirely Lionel's fault though. Lionel expected for his snowy star owl lineage factor to be like his metal synergy lineage factor. Lionel could squeeze out so much more power from his metal synergy lineage factor. As such, when he didn't receive comparable results from his snowy star owl lineage factor, he thought that the problem was that his lineage factor was too weak. Due to this, Lionel actually began plotting how to strengthen a lineage factor that could already be considered to be at the very pinnacle of what the sixth dimension could offer. It could be said that if the others of the Luxnix family were aware of his thoughts, they would hate him more than they already did. Visit. For a better user experience, the truth was that the snowy star owl lineage factor wasn't weak. In fact, it was far from it. It could even be said that there were some lower-level seventh-dimensional families that couldn't compare to it. The main issue was that Lionel didn't have the appropriate techniques to pair with it. As such, he could only display a fraction of what his true strength should be. It had to be remembered that the snowy star owl lineage factor was greatly reliant on one's affinity for snow force. However, what good was an affinity for a force if you didn't have the proper medium to make use of it? To put things into proper perspective, one needed to understand a few things. Firstly, the snowy star owl lineage factor worked differently from the Morales family's metal synergy lineage factor. The truth was that it was far less structured and systematic. To most of the Luxnix family, the talents of the snowy star owl couldn't be accessed until entering the sixth dimension. Only a rare few geniuses could awaken some branches before reaching this level. Before then, they mostly relied on their snow force affinity. As a powerful sixth-dimensional force, snow force stood at the pinnacle of most light elemental forces at this level. In the past, Lionel had dismissed snow force because he hardly considered it to be top 100 amongst light elemental forces, and it was hardly top 1000 among star elemental forces. What he didn't know was that such rankings were astoundingly good. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. How wide was the universe? How many families were there? How many different types of forces? To be ranked so highly on a list that was nearly infinite. If that wasn't excellent, then what could be? This advantage alone separated the Luxnix from other sixth-dimensional families. Though it wasn't enough to be treated with the utmost respect by that mysterious organization. The mere fact they had produced nominal students in the past was enough to show just how talented the people of their family was. Yet, even then, upon entering the sixth dimension, people of the Luxnix would undergo a qualitative change. They would begin to awaken their branch talents and their strength would explode forth by leaps and bounds. The most astounding of the Luxnix would awaken their branch talents to the second layer. These were the individuals that would become potential heirs, Star Order Elders, and 8-point and 12-point Feather Sword Warriors. Somehow, despite not even touching the sixth dimension, Lionel had awoken the second layer of 2 branches already, another shocking feat in its own right. Many of the best geniuses of the Luxnix would only ever awaken a single branch talent in their lifetimes. Noah shook his head as he looked up into the skies. I guess there went any chance they had of keeping a low profile. Unlike Lionel, Noah was aware of many more things. He knew exactly the kind of trouble this would bring. Visit. For a better user experience, he knew about Lionel's temper, and had been trying to find a way to ease into the discussion eventually since obviously, this had been thrusted onto his shoulders by his father and grandfather. But it seemed he wouldn't have the chance to be delicate about it all any longer. Sensing Noah's gaze, Lionel looked over and grinned. Not bad, right? Noah was speechless. Why did this cousin of his only seem to smile so brightly when there was trouble on the horizon? The Tier 4 youth holding onto the crystal ball stood speechless. Even as the lights in the skies slowly dimmed, and the crystal ball finally shattered in his hand, crumbling to the ground, he still didn't quite know how to react. Every fiber of his being wanted to say that it was fake, that the crystal ball was faulty. But he knew better than to say something so foolish. The only way for the bloodline density tester to react in this way was if the bloodline was considered to be perfect. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. The only way to bring the snowy star owl lineage factor to perfection was by awakening one of the branches to the second layer. But there was only one other person in the younger generation who had done this while still in the fifth dimension. Chapter 1100. We need to report this. The Tier 4 youth snapped out of his daze, realizing just how big this matter was. Galthan, we still haven't. A youth behind Galthan spoke out. They were meant to hand out 50 rooms a day until all of them were given away. They couldn't exactly shirk their responsibilities, right? Galthan's expression flickered, but he made a decision. This is more important. We need to go now. We'll move this back to another day. We have to hurry. Galthan turned to dash away. His two companions turned to leave as well, but they suddenly heard the sound of someone clearing his throat. Are you three really just going to leave like that? Galthan's steps froze and he turned back, his brows tightly furrowed into a frown. He was a member of the main branch. No matter what Lionel's bloodline density was, wasn't he being a bit too liberal with his words? The simply truth was that Lionel looked nothing like a person with a high density of Luxnix blood should. His skin was several shades too tanned. His hair was a nice shade of violet, but it definitely wasn't the same white or gold one would expect from a Luxnix, nor was it anywhere near as bright. By all rights, Noah looked far more like a Luxnix if you overlooked his emerald eyes. Due to these reasons, he hadn't expected much from Lionel to begin with, but now that he was calling out to him so casually, his suppressed displeasure was threatening to bubble forth. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. In the end though, Galthan managed to control his emotions. Regardless of what Lionel looked like, the test wouldn't lie. And knowing the family, he would likely be drafted into the main branch very quickly. In that case, Lionel's standing would be far superior to his own. There was no need to offend him for no reason. Do you need something? Galthan asked as neutrally as possible. Lionel smiled lightly, pretending not to see through Galthan's internal struggle. I and my companions are a bit poor. If we don't find a place to stay now, I'm afraid that we'll have to return to our home. By then, things might get a bit inconvenient for you. Galthan's expression flickered again. He couldn't decide whether Lionel was shameless or if he should be disdainful. What the hell was this? Clearly, Lionel was trying to get himself some free room and board using his newfound status. Forget it, it doesn't matter. If he enters the main branch, the room he claims will end up empty and it'll be the same result no matter what. I'll just give him the keys, he'll end up returning it anyway. How many rooms do you need? Lionel's gaze flashed as he finished the calculations. I need 12 three-person and 11 two-person rooms. Galthan's brow twitched, but he could already see that Lionel was trying to take a step back by not asking for the penthouse. In that case, it could be seen that he really needed these rooms. All right, here. Galthan tossed a spatial ring over. As for everyone else, please come back tomorrow. Visit. For a better user experience without waiting to hear the cries of discontent, Galthan scurried away, leaving Lionel with a smile on his face. Lionel's gaze flickered when he noticed that Raya had appeared before him. Without hiding the curiosity in her gaze, she looked him up and down as though trying to understand something. You two are related? She asked. Lionel tilted his head. He's my cousin. Raya's gaze lit with curiosity. For two young men related to one another to have such high bloodline densities, it most definitely wasn't a coincidence. It was more likely than not that both were tied to the same scandal. At that moment, everyone from Earth surrounded Lionel and Noah again, their expressions beaming as they hoisted the two into the air. Or rather, tried to. What the hell, Cap? Why are you so heavy? Lionel laughed. His weight didn't bother him in the slightest. He didn't even feel that it slowed his agility or speed at all. However, the same couldn't be said for others. In the end, they hoisted Noah up beneath his protest and kicked Lionel to the side entirely. Raya watched on with a curious light in her eye. Who were these people exactly? They seemed quite close. Visit. For a better user experience, Galthan and his two companions rushed toward their aircrafts. As members of the Luxnix family main branch, they had permits others would have to leap through countless hurdles to get, allowing them to fly their own crafts outside the designated starways. With their speed, they'd be able to return to the family estate in just a few hours. However, the three of them could have never expected to find the most beautiful woman they had ever seen waiting for them. None remembered what happened, but later that day when they returned to the estate, they reported none of what occurred almost as if they had forgotten entirely. Sitting on the clouds with a leisurely smile on her face, Eleanor's delicate features tinged with a red excitement as she enjoyed the simplicity of watching over her son. She hadn't felt so fulfilled in a very long time, but eventually she sighed. Mom has wronged you, little lion, but I need to do so one more time. This will be the last chance I give your grandmother. As a mother, my priority will always be your safety. However, I don't want to live in a world where my son and my own mother cannot speak to one another. So be patient with Mom, we will meet soon. Eleanor's expression flickered with a complicated light, but soon her smile returned as she watched her son interact with his friends. Her joy bubbled forth again as she could hardly contain it. Later that night, as the sun set, Leonel was pleasantly surprised to find the penthouse key in the spatial ring. He simply assumed that Galthan was trying to curry favor with him, and had no idea that it was his own mother who couldn't stand the idea of her son having anything less than the best. If Leonel knew that his mother had actually managed to secretly put something in the spatial ring without him even noticing, he would quickly realize just how large the disparity between himself and true experts was. However, Leonel didn't think much of it, because when he entered the penthouse he found something waiting for him on the massive bed. The latest _AP_SODs are on the website. This Chapter 11:01. When Eleanor saw Leonel notice the things she left behind, her smile beamed. She giggled foolishly in the skies as though she was a young girl again. Leonel blinked when he saw what was on the bed because even without touching it, he felt that it was all far too valuable. A part of him believed for a moment that this might have been in every penthouse suite, but something within him said that that should be impossible. Would the Luxniks really give so much to a branch family member? Leonel's brows furrowed, suddenly remembering the state the Radix family's wealth had left him in. Just one casual fort they had built used up enough herb, or to bury the Milky Way. Could it be another case of this? However, such thoughts were swept away in just a few moments. The Luxniks shouldn't know anything about Leonel yet, but these items felt too personal. Leonel took a step forward, not having the mind to care about the luxury around him. He climbed the small set of steps covered in lush carpets that led to the enormous bed, reaching out and grabbing the first crystal ball he saw. As though sensing Leonel's touch, the crystal ball gently burst into sparkling motes of light, releasing the item within. When it landed in Leonel's hand, he almost fell over. Despite his strength, the item was so heavy that just holding it up made him feel as though his biceps would tear. Luckily, seemingly sensing his weakness, the item sparkled, its weight becoming instantaneously lower. In fact, it suddenly felt as light as a feather in Leonel's hands. The latest _AP_SODs are on the website. In the skies, Eleanor blinked in shock before her eyes bloomed into crescent moons from smiling so wildly. That damn thing actually recognized my little lion from a single touch. Haha, my son is so talented. The wind around Eleanor seemed to respond to her laughter, vibrating as though the space itself would collapse. But by some sort of magic, all the turbulence vanished just a few meters from her. Leonel looked at the bow in his hand, his gaze sparkling. This is a gold-grade weapon. No, it's not just gold-grade, it's tier 9 gold-grade. There's just no way. Silver was the hallmark of the 6th dimension. Gold-grade meant that this was a 7th-dimensional weapon. If Leonel was unsure before, he was now completely certain that it was impossible for the Luxniks to have been the ones to leave these things behind. He looked up and around, but he really couldn't sense anything. Even after analyzing the room again and again, he couldn't find a single thing out of place. If that person left even a single strand of hair, Leonel would have been able to find it with his current abilities. And yet he couldn't pick up on even that. Was it Mom? Leonel blinked. That seems to be the only explanation, but why didn't she come to see me? Visit. For a better user experience seeing Leonel looking around and scanning, Eleanor felt her heart leap into her throat. She clutched her hands over her chest, pressing down firmly. It seemed to take all the strength she had in her body not to dash down there and embrace her son. Look at you. You've gotten so big. Seeing that he couldn't find anything, Leonel turned his attention back to the bow. It was without a doubt the most beautiful weapon he had ever seen, and it was most definitely the largest bow he had ever laid eyes on. From tip to tip, the bow was 3 meters long. Its string grooves were fashioned into the heads of 2 white-maned lions with shimmering rubies for eyes, while its body was embroidered gold and white gold. Finally, its bow string itself glistened like it was woven of crystal fibers, twinkling even in the non-invasive light of the penthouse suite. Lionel couldn't help but raise the bow up and pull at its string. He had expected to not be able to move it even an inch. Back when Lionel first ran into Merlin's bow in the Camelot zone, it had only been a quasi-bronze bow, and yet despite the strength of his body at the time, he could only pull it to 10%. With this being a gold-grade bow, a Tier 9 one at that, Lionel fully expected to not move it a single centimeter. If he could move it at all, he would feel shocked instead. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. And yet, to his surprise, not only did he move the bowstring, before he even realized what was happening, he had pulled it to 100%. A wild pressure circulated about the room. Lionel felt that the level 3 bow force that had been such a drain to accumulate in the past swirled around him as though it was on a leash. In fact, Lionel felt that even if he had to release dozens of such powerful arrows, he could do so now. Wow! Lionel's gaze lit up. This bow was beyond his expectations. Such an ability frightened even himself. Just based on a change in equipment, he was actually suddenly so much more powerful. And Lionel felt that this was likely just the tip of the iceberg when it came to this bow. Maybe he couldn't use its full abilities just yet because it was purposely lowering itself to his level. Lionel had no idea that, as shocked as he was, his own mother was quite speechless. Enlightened bow force? While in the 5th dimension, if Alienor had been laughing before, she was practically gasping for air now. Even over at that place, her son would be near the very top just based on this alone. Those bow enthusiast old fogies would be fighting tooth and nail for him. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Realizing that he was maybe causing too much of a commotion, Lionel slowly released his grip on the bowstring, looking at the bow with a hardly contained fondness in his eye. He didn't know how freely he would be able to use this bow. After all, a 7th dimensional treasure was far too valuable. Who knew how many people would try to kill him just to lay a hand on it? But it couldn't be denied that this gift was extraordinary. After a while, Lionel finally managed to peel his eyes from it and store the bow away. But when he touched the next crystal ball and saw its contents, his gaze widened. Chapter 11:02. The oars fell into a beautiful pile on the soft bed. For a very long time, Lionel couldn't bring himself to move or even breathe. He had to double and triple check that he was seeing correctly, and with his thinking speed he actually ended up checking several hundred times before he realized that it all wasn't an illusion. Evolution Oregon. Not just any evolution but both 5th dimensional and 6th dimensional evolution Oregon. Of the former, there were actually 20 essences worth. For the latter, there were exactly 10, the minimum amount Lionel needed. This was why Lionel had felt that these gifts were simply far too personal. Evolution was exactly what he needed to form the foundation of his divine armors, if he wanted to continue following his father's crazy plan. It had to be remembered that the divine armor Lionel was wearing right now was still 4th dimensional. The reason it could display so much strength within the 5th dimension was precisely because Lionel had used evolution as its foundation. The trouble with this approach, though, was the difficulty in finding evolution Oregon. Even after all this time, he had yet to catch the faintest clue about 5th dimensional evolution Oregon. But now, he suddenly had all he would need for his next 2 divine armors. Toward such a turn of events, Lionel could only be speechless. He knew that even for a 7th dimensional existence, these 2 gifts shouldn't have been so easy to get one's hands on. In fact, it wouldn't really be an exaggeration to say that it was near impossible. Visit. For a better user experience, a Tier 9 gold grade bow. 6th dimensional evolution How could Lionel not be shocked? Even with his limited scope of the dimensional verse, he knew just how valuable these things were. Lionel couldn't help but look around again. But, even with all the giggling of his mother, he couldn't detect her at all. Without a choice, he could only store these ores away as well. Now he just needed to find the core piece of his next divine armor, then he could start designing it. Lionel had already planned to use the snowy star pendant to exchange for the core of his fifth-dimensional divine armor. Now he was even more determined to do so. Lionel moved on to the next crystal ball, but this time he braced himself. If he got shocked to the point of silence every time, he might very well be here forever. The next crystal ball burst into motes of light and crystals, revealing a delicately embroidered pouch. It alternated in deep blacks and gently glowing golds. When Lionel opened it up, he found that it was actually a spatial treasure. Within it, he not only found billions of purple coins, there were even billions of kilograms of sixth-dimensional herb ore and millions of kilograms of seventh-dimensional herb Oregon visit. For a better user experience, it was safe to say that Lionel had never seen such wealth concentrated in one place. It only confirmed just how low his previous bounty was. He really was just a petty criminal. Of course, this wasn't exactly true. Tier 4 fugitives don't just fall out of thin air. The main reason Lionel's bounty was so low was because he was still technically a galaxy-level criminal. As such, his bounty was tied to the Milky Way, which was a poor corner of the universe. This was only to be expected. Still, in one moment, Lionel had been poor. And in the next, he could be considered to be one of, if not the wealthiest man on planet Luxnix. The difference was so striking that he almost experienced a bit of whiplash. With this, there were only 2 crystal balls left. Lionel stepped toward the second-to-last one, allowing it to shatter just like all the other ones had. However, unlike what Lionel had come to expect, there was actually another crystal ball waiting for him on the other side of this one. Curious, Lionel sank his mind into it, only to be bombarded with all sorts of information. At first, it was a bit overwhelming until Lionel pulled back. He had gotten into the habit of wielding his internal sight like a sledgehammer, because he could usually take in everything at once. But, clearly this was too much information even for him. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, once Lionel did so, his eyes practically shot out lasers of their own. Techniques. Thousands of them. And each and every one related to Snow Force and the Snowy Star Owl lineage factor. There were third-dimensional, fourth-dimensional, fifth-dimensional, and even sixth-dimensional techniques all in one place. There were techniques designed for those who hadn't awakened any branches whatsoever, and other techniques designed for those who had awakened one, or even multiple branches at a time. It was as though the entire history of the Luxnix family's advancements were all painted in this singular crystal ball. And Lionel had a feeling that if the Luxnix were aware of this, they would have been pissed off to an extreme. Lionel suddenly realized that the difference separating his combat prowess and that of the top geniuses of this sector was in his hands. These gifts were definitely all carefully selected for him. They were exactly what he needed. Lionel stored the crystal ball for now and moved on to the final one. When it shattered, he found that there was yet another crystal ball waiting for him. In fact, within he found more techniques. However, these techniques were far different from the Luxnix family techniques. In fact, they were designed not for the Luxnix, but rather the Fox. Lionel's brows shot up. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, there were only a handful of techniques, but each was uniquely curated. Each taught how to apply the Fox family lineage factor in cooperation with your strengths. If Lionel was correct, these techniques were likely personally designed and created by his mother. Only she could have all these unique combinations of powers. The first of the techniques Lionel seemed to gravitate toward made his heart tremble. Chapter 1103. Whether by coincidence or just a well-timed stroke of fate, the unmutated form of the Fox family lineage factor was actually called Emperor's Might, the perfect mirror of Lionel's King's Might. Just from a casual introduction, Emperor's Might functioned on the backs of your subjects and those who believed in you. It was an intangible sort of belief system that relied on how those around you viewed you. Despite not being an empress herself, Lionel's mother had great fame in the dimensional verse, even though her own son was oblivious to it all. That said, Even if she didn't, Eleanor was a bit of a special case due to her world spirit. By virtue of the fact she was chosen by Earth's world spirit, it was accurate to say that the life of Earth's population was tied to her. As such, even in comparison to Emperor Fox himself, Eleanor's emperor's might was on another level entirely. All of this said, after several months of observation, Lionel's king's might wasn't exactly the same, though the power itself presented very similarly. The first difference was that Lionel felt that he had the ability to share his king's might with his companions. Emperor's might could not do this. The second difference was that Lionel's king's might partially relied on his subjects, however it gained no boost from how others viewed him or his legend. Instead, Lionel's king's might seemed to feed off of Lionel's personal mental state, rather than the mental state of others. Visit. For a better user experience, these differences aside, the application of emperors and kings' might were exactly the same, and Lionel didn't believe that there would be a problem in applying them to these techniques. But Lionel was more interested in hearing exactly what was so special about this lineage factor. Luckily, his mother didn't disappoint him. So that's how it is. I see. Lionel had partially guessed it, but he hadn't quite grasped the full picture. Both emperors and kings' might were actually a derivative of dream force. In fact, they touched on a barrier that only savants could reach, falling just short of that penultimate height. Lionel, the dark cloud prison who had assumed the place of Lionel, had the ability to use his dream force to manifest his thoughts into reality. Using emperor's might and king's might, you wouldn't be able to go so far, but you were able to use your consciousness to affect change in your surroundings. Reading this sort of introduction, Lionel felt enlightened. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. When he had exited the Valiant Heart Zone, his hair had still been impossible to cut even with the increase in his strength. It was only by instinctively using his king's might coercion that what once was near indestructible hair became as fragile as paper. In fact, when Lionel brought his metal body to Tier 9 of the 5th dimension, his hair had grown out wildly again, and he was forced to cut it using this same method once more. Lionel never really thought much of it before, but this explanation made so many things click into place. It was no wonder why fusing his king's might into his domains made them so much stronger. He felt as though these simple words were opening up enormous doorways to him. Learning that his king's might was an extension of his dream force made Lionel feel as though he had finally grasped onto something that had always been constantly slipping through his fingers. He felt much lighter and far more confident now. When he finally turned his attention back to it, felt like it was made for him. In fact, he felt like all of these techniques were made for him. It fused the piercing gaze of the snowy star owl with Emperor's might, forming a level of sensory perception that internal sight alone couldn't match. It was able to see through illusions, the power levels of those beyond your dimension, and even see through usually invisible fluctuations in force. However, this was just the first level of the technique. Upon reaching the second level, your gaze could gain coercive effects of its own. In that case, your eyes could be used to disrupt and interrupt the flow of force. Visit. For a better user experience reading to this point, Lionel couldn't help but remember back to the flock of birds White City had brought to attack Camelot during Terrain's invasion. That species had been able to use their eyes to disrupt the flow of force, and it rendered mages completely useless. This technique seemed to take this to an extreme. If you were potent enough and you could see through the weak point of a technique with enough speed, just your gaze alone could force it to disperse. It was truly a beautifully constructed technique. In fact, Lionel felt the same about them all. He almost didn't care enough to even look through the Luxnix family techniques. He was completely immersed in the world of his mother's creation. It took a lot for Lionel to be impressed, mostly because with his mind, he was usually able to quickly deduce how people accomplished the things they did. Such an ability made it difficult for anyone to move him from his baseline. However, Lionel had nothing but praise for his mother. The straw that broke the camel's back was most definitely when Lionel saw a version of his mother had created that was several times better and more flexible than his own. Instead, she called it. The very same crystal balls that Lionel had received all of his gifts from were exactly an application of this technique. However, that was the easiest part to accept. What was absolutely fascinating was that a formation of could have a law attached to it. This law would be governed by your empire's might. Or in Lionel's case, his king's might. So long as you were within the confines of and the world was not broken, this rule had to be followed. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. That was when it clicked for Lionel. The law his mother must have attached to his gifts was that the world would open so long as Lionel was the one to touch them. Wow. Lionel was floored. The complexity of this technique was beyond his wildest imagination. Chapter 1104. Lionel felt that his was inferior to his mother's in almost every way, shape, and form. The only advantage he would have was in the sturdiness of the space he could create thanks to his version being anchored by earth force. But whether it was flexibility of use, stamina consumption, and applications in battle, it was a clean sweep for. Not to mention all of this was practically like having a domain of your choosing on command. Of course, the law you set worked better the simpler it was, so this wasn't exactly true. But if an ability like this was paired with Lionel's intelligence in battle, who knew how many people he could play to death with it? Lionel's fingers subconsciously stretched outward, wiggling about lightly as force followed their movements. Lionel had thought that he wouldn't be used to the foundational magic system his mother used to create this technique. After all, he had used Camelot's magic system to turn an artistic conception into reality, but his mother hadn't returned to Earth in a very long time, so she shouldn't have had the time to learn about it. But after analyzing the technique, Lionel was shocked to find that the foundation his mother used wasn't only similar, it was identical. He had no other way of explaining this other than chalking it up to his mother's world spirit. There didn't seem to be another way for her to have known about it. This conclusion led Lionel down another shocking revelation. His mother was like a cheat code. He had spent so much time analyzing and parsing out the secrets of Camelot's magic system, but his mother was years if not decades ahead of him. Subconsciously, the easiest first layer formed for Lionel, a small crystal ball appearing before him like a blown bubble. It reflected delicate rainbow colors as though it might pop at any moment. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience still observing Lionel up in the sky, Eleanor blinked in shock for already the third time that day. Was one of her most complicated techniques. Wasn't it a bit exaggerated to form a rudimentary form of it in just a few moments? I see. So that magic system fell in your hands. Lionel had no idea how correct he was. As the wielder of Earth's world spirit, Eleanor had many wide-ranging abilities. One of these abilities was being able to assimilate with the natural force arts that formed the foundation of Earth. When Camelot formed Avalon and became part of Earth's reality, Eleanor gained access to the natural force arts that formed their foundation. This, in turn, allowed her to improve her technique to the level it was currently at now. It could be said that Lionel had been helping his mom from countless light years away, something even she only became aware of right this moment. Had he never cleared Camelot's zone, their magic system wouldn't have fused with Earth and his mother would have never learned of them. A flicker of guilt lit Eleanor's gaze. How ironic. What a terrible mother I am. The idea that her son had been sweating and bleeding for her benefit made tears run down Eleanor's cheeks. She couldn't seem to control her flood of emotions at all. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Even now, all she could give her son was wealth and treasures. She was under no illusions that this somehow made up for all the years of his life that she had missed. Lionel was oblivious to all of this. He had no idea that it wasn't because his mother was decades ahead of him, but rather that as the world spirit wielder, she didn't need to study Camelot's magic system like he did. It came as naturally to her as breathing. Technically, she had learned the magic system at the same time she did. However, functionally, they might as well have had thousands of years of separation between them. A light purple aura formed around him, forcing the rainbow colors of the bubble before him to take on various hues of violet instead. This is a good thing. It also means that I'm right, Lionel mused. Logically, Mother should have a far wider view of the dimensional verse than I do. The fact that she had so many options before her yet still chose to use Camelot's magic system in specific must mean that even compared to all of them, this system is far superior. This conclusion made Lionel feel at ease. Before he had guesses, but he couldn't be absolutely certain. Right then, his finger flashed outward. A beam of spear force cutting through and crashing onto the surface of the bubble. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. A blade mark rebounded off the surface of the construction, leaving a deep mark. However, the world managed to quickly mend itself. Lionel calmly observed this before sending a fist covered in fist force forward. Unlike his level 2 spear force, this fist force was only the most ordinary level 1 fist force. And yet, the bubble shattered on the lightest impact, raining down motes of crystals and light. Lionel nodded to himself. He had set the law of this by stating that it was invulnerable to blade edges. However, by skewing the law so heavily in one direction, it made it incredibly fragile to blunt trauma. Obviously, since Lionel's blade had left a mark, the wasn't invulnerable. So his law wasn't the end-all, be-all, at least not with his current proficiency. However, Lionel still felt that such a thing was endlessly useful in combat. If I can use my mother's research to improve just what would the result be? Lionel's mind worked in overdrive, but he felt like his king's might was missing something. His attention turned back to his mother's techniques before he found exactly what had forced his dreamscape to spark. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Chapter 1105 was clearly a play on Emperor's Might, as far as Lionel could tell. But its use was far more than just that. In fact, it was quite fascinating. This technique was a method of Emperor's Might manipulation. As things stood now, under normal circumstances, Emperor's Might was like a sledgehammer. In its base form, both Alienor and Lionel could use it like a flood, trying to drown people out with it. However, just because it could be done, didn't mean that this was the most efficient way of doing so. Combined Emperor's Might with concepts of visualizations and artistic conception. In fact, if Lionel was correct, him taking time to comprehend could actually go a long way in helping him master the fifth-dimensional layer of. It had to be remembered that it was Lionel's shallow understanding of the fifth-dimensional layer of that led him down a path of using artistic conception to create mage arts. The fifth dimension was all about elevating the mind to release the shackles the body might harbor. This symbiotic relationship between mind and body was incredibly important. As such, using and mastering it would actually give Lionel a path toward increasing the speed of his improvement through the fifth dimension. Right now, Lionel's King's Might was nothing more than a formless fog. Whenever he made use of it, it would permeate his general surroundings before eventually sinking into whatever target he had set it on. The trouble with this approach was that it wasn't only a waste of energy, but it was also slow and not nearly as potent as it could be. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, the solution to this seemed quite simple. Since Lionel had such high dream force affinity, and he now knew that his King's Might was a derivative of it, why not simply take control of this fog and change its form? Of course he could do this, and this would likely help mitigate the slowing and wastage of his King's Might. However, that was all. It was a mere surface solution to it all. It was only after reading through that Lionel came to understand why he was so lacking in his use of his lineage factor. He was only at the first tier of the fifth dimension. He had yet to properly refine his mental state. In his current condition, his mind was like a wild and untamable beast that acted as it pleased. Lionel was under the illusion that he controlled himself, but just how much of his actions were based on his innate disposition? How much of himself was he controlling? And how much was decided at birth by an arrangement of his genes? It was quite the profound question. Why was it that some people endlessly procrastinated while others always seemed to be working? Was it really something as intangible as will? Or was it just a natural disposition? Or maybe will itself was decided by one's innate disposition? Remove the guesswork from all of this. So long as Lionel practiced it properly, he would be able to rein in his mind to a certain extent. And by attaching an artistic conception to his King's Might, it too would become several times more powerful. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Once he managed to do that, the laws he set for, or whatever upgraded version of his that he formed, would be exponentially more potent. Each level has a corresponding force art attached to it. Each really seems to be as complex as a natural force art. Was this really created by a person? Lionel couldn't help but be impressed once again. He had never seen a force art created by a person be so complex. Whether it was his auspicious aura force art or Camelot's magic system force art, both were exceedingly complicated. However, these force arts fell somewhere between the two in complexity, with Camelot's being by far the most complex. Was split into 9 levels with 3 major dividing lines. Despite being called, this name was actually more of a placeholder to convey the foundation of the technique's secrets. In reality, the artistic conception used was up to the user. This also allowed one the flexibility to improve upon in the future. Lionel wouldn't be surprised if his mother used the artistic conception of a dragon to give her emperor's might form. However, Lionel wouldn't even know where to start if he chose that path. He had never seen a dragon nor seen the depiction of one. Though he had read and seen a lot of them in fiction back in his younger years, that wasn't nearly enough. Wait, do dragons actually exist? Lionel's brow furrowed before he shook his head. That hardly mattered right now. What he needed was a proper artistic conception, one that was both easy to observe and easy to scale. With Lionel's thinking speed, he immediately thought of several possibilities. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, the first was Little Blackstar. Though the little guy seemed quite adorable and unassuming, he was both a shadow sovereign and now an heir to the void beasts, a creature that even Lionel's own father deemed it important to leave a message behind about. It might even be the case that void beasts were far more powerful than dragons. If dragons even existed, that is. The second choice was to choose something far more abstract, like a disaster world. So long as Lionel kept visiting disaster worlds of similar elements, he would also be able to continuously upgrade the artistic conception of his king's might. In addition, he would likewise be able to improve his universal cycles. It was like killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Both of these ideas felt excellent, but for some reason they left an uncomfortable feeling in Lionel's gut. He could somehow tell that if he really took this path, his king's might wouldn't like it, but he couldn't quite understand why. Until it all clicked. The difference between Emperor's might and King's might was that while the former gathered strength from outside influences, the latter gathered strength from yourself. Lionel suddenly felt a throbbing above his right hip, and he subconsciously reached a hand downward. A searing heat threatened to torch everything in the room, but for some reason Lionel felt exceedingly comfortable. Visit. For a better user experience in that moment, he felt like he knew exactly what he had to do. Chapter 1106. The poolside was quite lively. The past 3 days had been spent in complete leisure as the youths of Earth basked in luxury. None of them had realized just how much of a toll the war had taken on them until this moment. What was shocking to many of them, though, was that they hadn't been bothered at all. In fact, it didn't seem like anyone else was moving into their hotel either. It was as though the entire building had been locked down for their sakes. In the end, they could only brush it off and chalk it up to Noah and Lionel's performances. Maybe the Luxniks were still trying to figure out how to bring the two into their fold, and as such made some concessions on the front end. Either way, the group had access to as much food and entertainment as they wanted. It truly felt like they were on vacation. That day, as the high sun began to calm a bit, a few dozen of them sat by the poolside. Gil, practically grinning ear to ear, had an arm wrapped around 2 ravishing beauties he seemed to be whispering sweet nothings to. The two would often roll their eyes and giggle, but so long as Gil didn't get too handsy, they let him do as he pleased. For Gil, this was enough for him to be on cloud 9. Just a few days ago, he could only stare at beauties through a window pane. But now he could actually enjoy the touch of such slim waists with a single pinch. This was truly heaven. Ladies, you really should give me a chance. I might be fast, but I still know how to finish last. How could I call myself a gentleman without allowing 2 beauties to go ahead of me? Gil's gaze twinkled, his eyes sparking with crimson streaks of lightning as though to remind the two of his speedster status. The two women covered their mouths and laughed, but they gave Gil their usual non-answer. "Your pickup lines are lame," Franco called over from the deep end of the pool. Gil snorted. "Don't open that big mouth of yours too wide, you might drown." Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Franco sneered. "I'm bigger than you in other places too, but I'll spare the beauties the shock." The two women in Gil's arms turned completely red toward Franco's frankness. Toward this, Gil could only be displeased. With a flick of his finger, Gil sent an arc of lightning toward the pool. "Shit." Franco jumped, just barely getting out of the water before he was shocked. "You little bastard." Franco snarled. "Who are you calling little?" Gil seemed to forget about the two women in his arms as he let them go to charge after Franco. Soon, their third battle of the day had erupted, leaving the two maids looking toward one another with speechless expressions. The laughter and ambience of the poolside didn't fade as the two fought. In fact, it only seemed to become livelier. Some even began to place bets on who would win this time. To the side, Noah sat in silence. By some miracle, he had been convinced to wear a pair of swimming shorts, and his bold, refined chest was displayed for all to see. With how defined his muscles were, it would be difficult to pick a winner between him, Lionel, and Alan. Though, as usual, Alan was wearing overly baggy clothing even by the poolside. Is there a problem with Lionel? Jessica, who was wearing quite a conservative one-piece swimsuit, tried to strike up a conversation with Noah once again. Somehow, though, every time Noah looked toward her, he would look away just as quickly as though he was seeing something frightening. Visit. For a better_user experience, it was only after Jessica wrapped a shawl around her waist and partially covered her long, slender legs that Noah finally seemed to become normal again. No. I think he should be fine. Thinking back to what Noah had found on his bed 3 days ago, he assumed that Lionel must have received something as well. He was probably enthralled by it all. Cap. As though on cue, Lionel opened the side doors of the hotel to find himself by the poolside as well. Seeing that everyone was here, he couldn't help but smile. Yip. Yip. Little Blackstar hopped from Lionel's head, jumping toward the group of ladies who seemed to fall in love with him instantly. Clearly, they had no idea how much of a pervert the little guy was. "You guys seem to be having a lot of fun. Seems I've missed out." Hee, don't worry, Cap. I know you were just enjoying the presents we sent your way." Gil, who had Franco in a headlock, looked over with a mysterious grin. Lionel blinked in confusion. "Presents? Yeah. Don't worry, Cap. We'll keep it a secret for you." Visit. For a better_user experience, Lionel was speechless. He had no idea that these guys had sent over some service women to his penthouse. But long before they could even make it to his door, they had been intercepted by his mother. How could Eleanor allow her son to be serviced by such low-class women? Eleanor was all in favor of Lionel having dozens of wives, but they all had to be of the highest quality. He couldn't just wildly cede any plot of land. Lionel, though, had no idea about any of this and could only make some connections through the hardly disguised lewd gazes of his brothers. It was to the point even the women picked up on it, leaving them with no other choice but to turn their heads away in embarrassment. Lionel opened his mouth to explain, but in the end just shook his head and sighed. He had to admit that he was a bit pent up. The stronger his body became as he progressed his metal body, the stronger those urges seemed to become. It also didn't help that he had been abstaining from such thoughts ever since Aina vanished. He shook his head again. What am I thinking? Gil's perversion is rubbing off on me. Still, who knows, with how big the event these 3 planets are planning seems, maybe Aina will be here too. Lionel was filled with a complicated emotion. How would he face Aina when he met her? He didn't like the idea of apologizing because he didn't feel like he had done anything wrong. Or at the very least, he felt that they had wronged each other. Forget it. Maybe as a man it was his duty to suffer a loss in this case. Who cared who was right or wrong as long as they could be together again? Wait, that was wrong too. If they approached things like that, the festering wounds that led to their separation in the first place would only grow. Then they'd probably end up separated again. Lionel felt a headache coming on. At that moment, several strong auras suddenly converged on their hotel's poolside. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Lionel looked up to see several youths making their way forward. All of them had a single thing in common. They shared the Luxnix bloodline. Chapter 1107. Lionel calmly observed these approaching figures. There weren't many of them, and it also wasn't clear what their purpose was at a single glance. However, Lionel had some guesses. The peace could only last for so long. Their group had not only somehow monopolized an entire hotel and its amenities for themselves, but they hadn't even had to fight for it like the others had. Such branch family members wouldn't dare to find trouble with the main Luxnix family, so the next best option was to attack the root of their dissatisfaction to begin with. At first, they were apprehensive. After all, some lingering rumors about what must have happened 3 days ago had circulated. Many thought that it wouldn't be long until members of the main branch came to usher Lionel and Noah in. If they made a move before that, wouldn't they be shooting themselves in the foot? But after 3 days of no movement, not to mention a few more rooms being claimed through competition, the other branch family geniuses seemed to realize that the Luxnix didn't have the intention of coming for Lionel and Noah now. Logically, it should only take an expert of the Luxnix a few hours at most to come here using a flying craft. If they used a teleportation formation, it would at most take a few minutes. 3 days was definitely too long even if potential delaying factors were taken into consideration. The fact that the Luxnix hadn't come more than likely meant that they were still waiting for Lionel and Noah to prove themselves. These branch family members had no way of knowing what the strength gauge for main branch members were. They only knew that Lionel and Noah were better than they were, but they didn't have a frame of reference for the main branch. This, along with the fact the matters of that day were only being spread by vague recollections, made solid deductions even more difficult. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience in the end, the other branch geniuses found themselves to be greatly dissatisfied. The youths of Earth hadn't even had to fight for their places. Since the Luxnix were clearly still testing them, didn't that mean that defeating them would gain them fame as well? At the helm, 3 youths with gazes that practically spit fire led the group. Though Lionel had no idea who they were, their auras were quite strong, all of them having stepped into Tier 7. Behind them, there were a handful of Tier 5 and 6 existences. If Lionel was more informed, he would have known that these 3 youths were yet more members of the Luxnix top 10 branches. This time, rather than the 10th and 12th ranked, it was the 8th, 7th and 5th. The Luxnix family system worked quite simply. The main branch was located within this 3-pillar galaxy and shared the quadrants evenly with the Viola and Montex families. The branch families spread themselves throughout the sector. Some of the most powerful controlled entire galaxies of their own, while the weaker ones controlled several quadrants within a galaxy. A branch family's rank wasn't static and rather fluctuated. There were monthly, yearly, and per-decade rankings. This system stopped branches that were on top from growing complacent, and also gave lower-ranking branches a chance to display their hard work and claim rewards. This ranking system was based on contribution. This included zones of note cleared, taxes paid, worlds conquered, and even additional elective contributions. These contributions were tallied and given scores that would eventually reflect in the rankings. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, of course, the more powerful families tended to have the better rankings and received the most support from the main branch. The 8th branch was known as the Muiter branch, the 7th the Unia branch, and the 5th the Cuvan branch. Though their rankings weren't as stable as the top 3 branch families, their confidence spoke volumes for itself given how boldly they had chosen to come here. What the hell is this? I spent all that time waiting, being held back for this? They're practically all in Tier 1, is this a fucking joke? The youth from the Unia branch, Kraka's Luxnix, wantonly swept his internal sight everywhere he pleased. Without even trying to hide it, he showed not a single person present a single ounce of respect. However, just before he could finish his sweep, Kraka's brows furrowed as he looked up to meet Lionel's gaze. Lionel himself stood where he had always been, his hands in his pockets and his gaze indifferent. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Kraka's lip curled into a sneer. He had been holding back before, but since this brat wanted to play, without an ounce of hesitation, Krakas unleashed his internal sight in full force, already imagining the sight of Lionel's internal sight shattering into shards of glass. Even though this would only leave the latter a bit dizzy for a few moments, he was already feeling a sick satisfaction from it. Great affinity with snow force, even without awakening the wisdom branch, made the internal sight of the Luxnix sturdier than most others. It had to be remembered the one had to take normal force to convert into soul force. With soul force, one could project one's internal sight. However, some forces were far better in conversion than others were. Krakas was confident in his own soul force, not only because of his Luxnix blood, but also because of his ability index. Whoever this fool was would suffer very soon. Unfortunately, just as quickly as Krakas sneered, he found his expression warping in the next moment. Lionel's internal sight was like a thick, impenetrable fortress. Krakas could feel his own crumbling just after ramming into it. No, it wasn't crumbling. It felt as though just touching Lionel's internal sight made his slowly erode. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Right when Krakas panicked and wanted to pull back, the form of Lionel's internal sight suddenly changed. From a fortress, it became numerous spiked ramrods, pushing forward with an air of lethality. Krakas shot backward to the very shock of his companions, and retracted his internal sight as fast as he could. However, he was still a step slow. Krakas' body convulsed, his knees buckling as his face turned pale. He fell to the ground, his gaze somewhat vacant. Chapter 1108. From start to end, Lionel didn't move a single inch. In fact, those with weaker senses wouldn't have even been able to tell that a clash was occurring at all. It could only be said that Krakas was too foolish. While he had snow force to strengthen his internal sight, Lionel had already awakened his wisdom branch to the second layer, and his mind already had the boundaries and sturdiness of an individual at the quasi-sixth-dimensional level. This had been the case long before he ever stepped into the fourth dimension, let alone now that he was in the fifth. As though that wasn't enough to widen the gap, Krakas used regular soul force while Lionel used the purest form of soul force, dream force. With this disparity, even if Lionel only crudely controlled his internal sight, he would have still been able to crush Krakas. But after being given the Luxnix library of techniques, Lionel had touched upon an entirely new level of internal sight control. The breadth of techniques the Luxnix had in this regard were impossibly numerous. Just now, Lionel had only used the most basic of third-dimensional internal sight manipulation techniques, and yet the difference was actually so striking. Of course, there was one other reason why the difference was so drastic, a reason related to the corrosive attack Krakas felt true fear for. It could only be said that Krakas had shot himself in the foot. Krakas. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, the members of the Unia branch that had followed rushed after Krakas to help him up. The latter was still in a daze, but his cloudy eyes began to slowly sharpen, only for it to flash with a hint of seriousness and fear. He felt that if Lionel had insisted on pursuing him in that moment, his outcome wouldn't have been as simple as a spout of dizziness for a small while. He almost felt as though his mind could have been destroyed. Of course, Krakas doubted that Lionel could really accomplish it. This wasn't because he was looking down on Lionel. He had already learned a lesson against that just now in the harshest way possible. The main issue was that internal sight that had been retracted into the mind couldn't be so easily messed with. In fact, trying to do so would have put Lionel in danger instead. The leading youth of the Muiter and Kuvin branches looked back toward Krakas with equally serious expressions. They had been paying attention to what happened just now. Usually, internal sight was quite fluid. Several internal sights could overlap and pass through one another without issue normally. However, techniques for internal sight taking shape and form like that were extraordinarily rare, and those who had such proficiency in them were even rarer. It almost felt like a perfect one-to-one of Lionel's consciousness. Of course, they had no idea that it was exactly this. With Dream Force, Lionel's control of his internal sight was a thought away. After all, Dream Force was the embodiment of consciousness. So you were a specialist of the wisdom branch. It seems we've underestimated you. Nigrith, the Tier 7 youth of the 5th-ranked Cuvan branch, looked toward Lionel deeply, his tone and expression touched with a hint of seriousness. The latest _AP_SODIs are on _the website. The wisdom branch was probably the most respected of the Snowy Star Owl's 3 main talent branches. The Luxniks had a saying that it was from wisdom that all other things sprout. Those who specialized in the wisdom branch had statuses that were a margin higher than those who were of the speed or healing branch. However, that was all. This wasn't enough for these youths to back down. It had only taught them that they shouldn't get into a war of internal sight with Lionel. Seeing that they had come to such a conclusion, Lionel didn't bother to correct them. There wasn't much of a point. It likely wouldn't be long before they learned the true extent of his abilities. Might I ask what you 3 have come for? Lionel smiled lightly, however his brothers had already snapped out of their fun-having state to stare toward the newcomers. Ridden, the final Tier 7 youth of the Muator branch, looked Lionel up and down, his fists itching. For some reason, Lionel's smile reminded him of the hypocritical smiles of all those old fogies. But for other reasons he couldn't seem to bring himself to hate it as much. We came for battle, of course. He spoke out, taking a step forward. In all this time, the other branches have been competing every day for the sake of the resources they get to enjoy. Your hotel still has 100% of its maidservants, amenities and food. Yet, you're the only group that has yet to fight a single battle. It seemed that the competition didn't stop at claiming rooms. After this, it became a contest of the hotels and a fight for resources. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, I see. Lionel nodded. So you want our resources? Aside from the obvious, why's that? Lionel calmly observed the group before him. Ridden's sneer deepened. None of us know when the competition will begin. Isn't it only right that we try to gather up as many resources as we can to improve in what time we have left? If we can sharpen our skills against good sparring partners, wouldn't that be even better? Lionel nodded. That did, indeed, make sense. He had hoped to learn more about this competition, but he guessed that this much was already enough. He gazed toward everyone around him and laughed. Well, you all heard him. They want to spar for resources. I haven't eaten in quite a few days. You guys have fun. Lionel's feet glided against the grass and eventual polished stone surrounding the poolside. Under everyone's gazes, he made it to the barbecue and started fixing himself an enormous plate of food. Whether it was the youths of Earth or the branch youths, they could only stand and watch, speechless. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience before any of them had reacted, Lionel had already begun to munch on an enormous beast's leg. He looked up with an innocent expression on his face. What are you all waiting for? They only came with 9 people. There are over 50 of us. Gang up on them. Chapter 1109. Shameless. Lionel looked up from his plate of food to see an enormous battle royale having broken out. Whether it was Crocus, Nigrith or Ridden, or even their followers, all of them were instantly infuriated. However, toward this reaction Lionel could only shrug. Though Crocus was a bit rude in his remarks, that didn't mean he wasn't correct. The youths of Earth were, indeed, far too weak. Even the most advanced of them was only at Tier 2, and that happened to be Noah. Lionel himself would likely break into Tier 2 in a few days thanks to the benefits of, but compared to these Tier 5, 6, and 7 youths, it was really not worth mentioning. The worst part was that Lionel was fully aware that this was just the tip of the iceberg. He still remembered that Raya girl from a few days ago. She was already Tier 8 and her talent itself was far beyond the youths that had come here today. And these were all branch family members. If the difference between them and the branch families was already this large, what about the difference between them and the main branch? What about the other 2 pillar families, the Viola and the Montex? Lionel vaguely felt that maybe bringing everyone here was a mistake, but in the end he shook his head. What good was it if they stayed sheltered? Facing the world like this would only help them improve faster. Why am I thinking like some old man? I need to improve too. Lionel took another large bite out of his food, his gaze scanning the battlefield. From just a cursory glance, he could tell that it took on average 3 of Earth's geniuses to face just one of them. The difference was there for all to see. Visit. For a better user experience in truth, this revelation was more shocking than not for the Branch family geniuses. The gap between experts of the 5th dimension were enormous, especially if it was the gap of 1 or 2 watersheds. There were 3 higher-tier geniuses and 6 middle-tier geniuses, while all of Earth's youths were still in the lower tier. The fact that it only took 3 to bridge this gap was more shocking than anything else. To put this matter into perspective, even if they had to fight 50 Tier 1 experts alone, they should have been able to do it. If these Tier 1 experts were from lesser worlds, even hundreds to thousands of them shouldn't have been able to bridge the gap. The fact that 3 could was shocking enough. Still, Lionel could only sigh at this result. He wasn't quite sure of what to do. Should he use the money his mother left him to help? No. That wouldn't make much of a difference. The accommodations the hotel provided were excellent. They had all the nutrients and support 5th-dimensional existences could ask for. Should he use the silver tablet to help loosen their bottlenecks? This was a possibility, but, having learned about the three-finger cult, Lionel realized that his past acts of openly and freely using the silver tablet was far more dangerous than he knew. He had only done so because he thought he was the only one potentially aware of its existence, but clearly this wasn't the case. Realizing this, Lionel knew that he couldn't casually rely on the silver tablet any longer, at least not for people he didn't have absolute trust in. He would trust his brothers with his life, but he barely had a surface relationship with the other youths of Earth. He didn't have the luxury of freely believing in them. Hold this USOB. Raj swung down a massive hammer of metallic sand. His violent movements caused that layers of fat that coated his body to peel backward and press down, surprisingly revealing the hint of a powerful physique. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. This wasn't too surprising to the others. Before the metamorphosis, the strongest of them all in terms of raw power was most definitely between Raj and Arnold. It was too bad he refused to lose weight even after no longer needing it for football. Lionel smiled as he watched them all push the Branch family geniuses back. His gaze slowly left the battle, aiming up toward a distant hotel roof. Did he see us? So what if he did? Another responded with a yawn. Isn't this a bit too shameless? We should just storm down there and end it all. By the time we're finished, they won't have a place here any longer. Maybe, but it's interesting, don't you think? What the hell is interesting about these weaklings? None of them have Luxnick's blood. Of the 2 that do, one of them is clearly not trying very hard, while the other is eating. Yet despite not having Luxnick's blood, or Viola and Montek's blood for that matter, it only takes 50 of them to overwhelm 9 of us. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. A snort sounded. Don't us me together with them. Those few down there don't even have 0.20 blood density. Why are you lumping me in? Just shut up about yourself for a second. If you want to be so arrogant, why don't you take that attitude to the Luxnick's family estate? Go see how the real geniuses feel about you. The snorter fell into silence, sending a glance over to the man by his side. Anyway, use your head for a second. How is it that a group of youths without a drop of the 3 strongest bloodlines of this sector somehow have the strength to fight back in a 50-on-9 battle against individuals who do have it? Don't you think it's fishy? The rooftop fell into silence. This was indeed a bit surprising. While the numbers looked unfair, it should have been unfair for Earth, not the other way around. Oh. He disappeared. No, he's right here. The 3 shifted their gaze to find Lionel's smiling figure looking back at them. At some unknown time, Lionel had gone from eating his fill to standing on the very same roof as them all. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Chapter 11:10. Hello. Lionel smiled lightly as though he was meeting some old friends. The three youths before him were quite unique. They all had golden hair, though not as pure nor as bright as main branch members. However, what truly distinguished them were their eyes. One had a pair of radiant blue irises, another had very warm brown eyes that seemed only a shade or two away from amber, and the last very pale green eyes. These were the hallmarks of the top 3 branch families of the Luxniks. There was Kian, the Tier 7 genius of the 3rd-ranked Vora branch, and his pale green eyes. Vaughn, the Tier 7 genius of the 2nd-ranked Strack branch, and his brown near-amber eyes. And finally, there was Run, the Tier 7 genius of the 1st-ranked Ruatern branch. Each of these 3 branches controlled an entire galaxy all to their own, and had positions that were quite interchangeable. The gap between them were so close that they were functionally seen as a single unit. In fact, there was a large disparity between themselves and the 4th-ranked branch families and beyond. Lionel couldn't help but note that all of these top-line geniuses were Tier 7. The only exception had been Raya, who was Tier 8. That was likely not a coincidence, but Lionel didn't have enough information or data points to draw a conclusion. Of course, if Lionel had known that Richard Viola, who he had met in the Dimensional Cleanse trial world, was a member of the Viola family, he would have noted that he too had been Tier 7. By then, he might have realized that there was more to this than what it seemed. Kian, Vaughn and Ren all looked toward one another before looking back toward Lionel. They had been leisurely watching the battle in one moment, but the instant they lost track of Lionel, he had already appeared here. Was it teleportation? But there was at least a half-kilometer distance between themselves and where Lionel had been. How could someone in the 5th dimension teleport so far in a 6th-dimensional world? Their expressions turned serious. I assume that you came here for a reason? Kian, the most abrasive of the 3, was the first to recover, dressing down Lionel with his gaze. Visit. For a better user experience, of course. Lionel said lightly. I just wanted to ask you all not to make things too difficult on me and my people. It would be quite a problem if we also had to fight you all too. The 3 were stunned. What had this man just said? Did they hear correctly? Kian burst into a fit of laughter, slowly standing up from his reclining chair. His green eyes flashed to a peak of emerald for a moment as he took a step forward. Are you asking us to show mercy? Well, if you want to think of it that way, to accept my proposal, sure. Kian's sneer only deepened when he heard this. This is the first time I've ever heard of a Luxnix being so cowardly. Sure, we can agree not to attack you. Just hand over all your resources and scram first. If you didn't even want to fight, why did you come all the way here? To embarrass your ancestors? Not exactly. Lionel responded quite calmly despite Kian's words. How old are you this year? Kian frowned hearing the line of questioning. However, it wasn't like his age was a secret to begin with. Since Lionel was being so amusing, he thought he would oblige. I'm 102 this year. If you're thinking of using your age as an excuse, I've already been at Tier 7 for 13 years already. If I had wanted to, I could have been in the 6th dimension already. Lionel nodded. Well, the oldest of them is only 23. Don't you think you should show some leeway as their senior? Visit. For the best know_vel_read_ng experience, the pupils of the 3 constricted. What they didn't know was that it wasn't exactly accurate to say that they were 23. After all, many of them had only been in the dimensional verse for 4 to 5 years. On the other hand, these branch family geniuses started training when they were toddlers. It simply wasn't the same. After his initial shock, Kian's face settled back down. I don't know if you're trying to bullshit me or not, but do you take me for a fool? Where would you possibly get so many young 5th-dimensional beings from? And, even if by some small miracle you weren't lying, so what? You want me to give up my chance at a bright future because you're all so young and innocent? Even if you were a baby in a stroller, if it meant me claiming a spot among them, I'd stab a knife through your chest without hesitation. Lionel fell into silence when he heard these words. His gaze shifted from Kian to the other 2. You're right, he finally said. It was a bit stupid of me to ask for such a thing. Lionel's palm flipped over, and a 3-meter-long dual-bladed silver spear appeared. Let's fight then. Within the Luxnix family estate, two familiar young men sat, enjoying the lavish lifestyle they had been living over the last several weeks. It had simply been too long since they had a chance to rest like this. Being in that place had always felt like being in a constant hellish storm. Of course, these two young men were the prim and proper Orinik and the lazy, untidy Ganner. It wasn't much of a surprise, then, that one side of the dining table was filled with clean plates and cleanly cut pieces of meat while the other looked as though a tornado had passed through. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, however. At that moment, both young men froze in unison, their gazes turning somewhat vacant as though they were listening intently to something. Young sirs, Orinik and Ganner were currently being entertained by the geniuses of the Luxnix family. Though Miguel wasn't present, the only three youths of this generation to surpass 0.50 bloodline density were. The one who spoke was the youngest and shortest of them. Unlike most of the Luxnix, he had also cut his bright golden hair short, with much of the sides of his head being completely hairless. He was Siller Luxnix, the preeminent genius of the Luxnix main branch's speed arm. When the two recovered their sharpness, Ganner completely ignored the question and went back to eating, but Orinik smiled lightly and explained, "We've received word that the first round of the selection event will begin in a month's time." Oh. Siller's gaze brightened. He looked like he was still a child in his early teens, but the truth was that he was well into his 30s already. HM. The second of the three geniuses spoke. He was none other than Eloquin, the preeminent genius of the Luxnix main branch's wisdom arm. He seemed to carry the sharp eyes and slick tongue one would expect from such a person, and he was the tallest of the three. It seems that it's about time we invite those of the branch families who passed to the family estate. The latest _AP_SODIes are on website. Chapter 11:11. Lionel's blade flashed, his bronze runes blazing to life as a silver armor covered him from head to toe. The pupils of the three constricted. They could tell that this wasn't an armor Lionel summoned, it was rather one that was perfectly integrated with his body. The first possibility was that he had constructed this armor out of exceptionally rare materials that could be fused with organic material. The second possibility was that this was a second lineage factor. Regardless of which the truth was, the objective reality was one thing. Lionel was powerful. Very powerful. As though to agree with their speculation, a strong spatial domain suddenly descended. The three youths felt as though it took twice the effort to move the same distance as it had in the past, forcing their expressions into an even more serious state. There was no doubt in their minds that this was an ability of this armor Lionel had just brought out. "You want to fight now? Fine." Kian's expression settled down, his own force beginning to roll forward in waves. "You must really think that I'm some sort of pushover." Kian's palm flipped over, revealing a glaive almost an entire meter taller than himself. Its polearm was a sleek black, and its blade was a striking, venomous green. The blade itself was somewhat transparent, and even seemed refined of a special sort of glass. However, the instant Kian's snow force erupted forth, it lost all its dullness and began to glow to the point its transparency vanished, leaving behind a blade that was not only almost double the size it had been originally, reaching almost 3 feet in length, but also one that shimmered as though it was made entirely of light. An uncomfortable feeling began to hang in the air. Lionel didn't need to think very much to know that this stickiness on his skin was a poison warning. However, as though he couldn't sense this strangeness at all, he shot forward, his spear drawing an elegant arc in the air. Kian sneered, his own blade swinging downward, but his pupils constricted at the result. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Kian had been certain that his weapon would be beyond Lionel's. He currently had a Tier 7 bronze-grade glaive in his possession, and it perfect synergized with his abilities. One would be hard-pressed to find a youth with a better weapon than himself. However, the instant they clashed, Kian realized he couldn't have been more wrong. Lionel's spear was actually of the quasi-silver grade. Kian's approach instantly changed. With a skill rarely seen, the instant their blades clashed, he pulled back, his stance shifting. His movement was so swift that it made it difficult to tell anything had happened, but Lionel himself felt as though he had just swung into a target made of cotton. Kian's glaive continued to glide backward, dispersing the strength of Lionel's blow and sweeping it to his back after a sidestep. His gaze lit with greed, but he reined it under control. Lionel might have wielded a spear, but the mechanics and design of it wasn't far from his own glaive, and the length was about the same. He could easily see himself using it. And even if he decided that it wasn't worth his time, he could easily sell it to afford to upgrade his own weapon. Since Lionel had chosen to make an enemy out of him, he didn't mind taking him for all the money he was worth. He is more skilled than anyone I've battled before. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. This was the thought that Lionel had almost instantaneously. Lionel had never had any formal training in the spear, and much of what he knew came from himself, and cobbling together the insights of the masters of the spear domain. Compared to Kian, who had clearly been wielding a glaive since he was a child, there was a bit of a gap. At least, there was a gap until he activated it. Lionel didn't hesitate, his forehead beginning to pulse with a golden light. Through the visor and helmet of his armor, the shimmering print of a golden spear made itself known. In unison, Lionel pressed forward, wild spear force suddenly erupting around him. In one moment, Kian was effortlessly gliding Lionel's force to a harmless location. In the next, Lionel's spear had flipped in his hands, a second blade cutting toward Kian's neck with a violent momentum. Kian's expression changed. Impossible. Vaughn and Rin no longer remained seated, realizing that this would be a problem instantly. Vaughn and Ren both flipped their palms to reveal two swords. As though by tacit agreement, they pincered Lionel in from both sides. If Lionel dared to continue his strike, he would definitely end up fatally wounded. On one side, Vaughn's swordsmanship was like a rocky avalanche, erratic and alternating between soft mudslides and harsh, rolling boulders. On the other, Ren's swordsmanship was akin to a rippling wave. A single flick of the wrist caused fluid and sudden movements. There was something decidedly beautiful about it all. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, the differences were both reflected in the size of their sword. Ren's was barely 2 fingers wide while Vaughn's was easily 4. One used a single hand while the other insisted on 2. At that moment, though, the three were suddenly shrouded by an oppressive aura. Fear gripped their hearts and sweat coated their palms, nearly causing their weapons to slip from their hands. Duality. The flickering image of a small man barely 3 inches tall appeared above Lionel's head. The instant it did, Lionel's domains seemed to become like unshakable laws of the world, so ingrained into reality that they became as fundamental as gravity itself. All the strength that Kian, Vaughn and Run had mustered in that moment was suddenly sapped away, flooding Lionel's own body and filling him with a raging power. Kian's gaze flickered with despair as Lionel's blade reached his neck, drawing blood. The crimson droplets sprinkled to the floor, leaving the hotel roof beneath an eerie silence. More coming. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 11-12. Lionel's blade just barely nicked Kian's skin, the cold glint in his eyes obvious beneath his visor. The 3 youths were shaken. Even though Kian was the only one with a blade to his neck, Vaughn and Ren, who were practically trapped in space, were just as fear-filled. Vaughn and Ren had never stopped piercing their swords forward. It was just that so much of their strength has been sapped by Lionel's duality domain that what once was twice the effort to move the same distance had become over a dozen times the effort. If one didn't look closely, it would seem as though they had been frozen in time. The 3 had been able to pretty much ignore Lionel's spatial domain by diverting their force to counteract it. But when it was paired with this second domain, it felt as though they were small fish swimming against the ocean's tides. But this was only the tip of the iceberg. He used natural spear force, natural spear force, enlightened spear force. These were Lionel's so-called level 1, level 2 and level 3 weapon forces. He might not know their true names due to purposely keeping himself ignorant, but this didn't mean that the same could be said for others. Visit. For a better user experience the moment Lionel's natural spear force erupted, Vaughn and Rin knew that they had still underestimated Lionel. To put these matters into perspective, even in the top 3 branch families of the Luxnix, not a single soul of the younger generation had awakened to their natural weapon force. In fact, each of them could count on a single hand the number of 6th-dimensional old monsters who had accomplished this in their families. However, even with that being the case, none of the 3 of them could take their eyes off of the 3-inch being sitting above Lionel's head. They felt as though their souls were being sucked out of their bodies every time they laid eyes on it, their knees threatening to collapse beneath them. It felt like that small little being was the antithesis of all that was life. It embodied pure death and destruction as though it wouldn't stop until everything was eradicated. Just looking toward it made them all feel a piercing pain in their heads. Lionel slowly retracted his spear and pierced one end into the ground. I think the result is pretty obvious now and we don't need to continue, correct? Lionel swept a gaze over the 3 of them. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Kian, Vaughn and Ren all remained silent, their jaws clenched. By now, Vaughn and Ren had lowered their swords. They realized that there wasn't much of a point in continuing. Even if this technique took a lot out of Lionel, something that was very clearly not immediately obvious, it was still more than enough time for him to take them out. Even after several moments of thought, none of them could think of a counter. In all likelihood, even if there was some sort of counter to this, they simply weren't privy to it. Of course, this small figure was the manifestation of Lionel's. Rather than taking the form of something else, it took the form of himself and gave his king's might a tangible representation. In truth, even Lionel hadn't expected his king's might's artistic conception to be so powerful. But he was well aware that this was only one part due to his king's might itself, but at least 2 to 3 parts due to the artistic conception he had chosen. Lionel couldn't help but take another subconscious glance toward his right hip. He felt that even now he hadn't quite understood just what was in his body and what it represented. Just as Lionel was about to nod and leave, not particularly needing the response of the 3 of them, a sudden surge of force caught his attention. Lionel's brow furrowed as his head snapped in a certain direction. From this vantage point, he could just barely catch a glimpse of a corner of the long pathway leading up to the 10 hotels. Near the front, there was a large community square laid of stone. Under normal circumstances, such a location would be used for the in and out traffic of vehicles. But with this being the private property of the Luxnix, it wasn't truly used in this way. The latest _AP_SODIES are on website. In that moment, a platform rose up and the large fountain that had taken up the center of the square became a teleportation pad upon which several individuals appeared. Lionel's gaze immediately narrowed. He couldn't see the others because his own hotel blocked the view of them from this viewpoint, but the one he could see left Lionel feeling a tangible pressure. Lionel had no reference for how powerful those of the main branch were, so he had subconsciously believed that the gap between them and the like of Kian, Vaughn and Ren couldn't be too far apart. But it only took this single experience for him to understand just how wrong he was. The gap was enormous. In fact, it was akin to night and day. The 2 groups might as well have been completely alien to one another. Is that so? Right then, the sound of a sonorous bell resounded. The battle between Lionel's brothers and the people of Earth against those of the 5th, 7th and 8th branch families came to a halt. Though unfortunately for the latter group, their sudden stop resulted in many of them getting sucker punched. But who could blame the youths of Earth? After all, they didn't understand the significance of that sound. Whatever rage the branch family youths had about this though could only be quickly doused in water. This is an edict of the Luxnix. All those with bloodline densities of 0, 10 and higher are to report here within the next 10 minutes. Failure to do so will result in 10 lashes and excommunication from the family. Visit for the best no_vel_read_ing experience. Chapter 11-13. Lionel's brow raised when he made eye contact with Noah. There was something particularly shifty about Noah's gaze at the moment, as though he wanted to say something or was regretting something. But he also seemed to realize that it was too late to do so. The both of them had been making their way to the front of the hotel after hearing the announcement when they crossed paths. It was immediately obvious to Lionel that Noah was holding back something. It makes sense. Noah probably knows more about the Luxniks than I do, but he isn't a very talkative person to begin with, so he probably didn't know how to start the conversation. Lionel smiled and shook his head. He couldn't decide whether this cousin of his was a block of wood or an adorable teddy bear. Either way, whatever it was, Lionel didn't think it would change much. The fact that those presents had been left for him gave him a clue to something. At the very least, he didn't think that his life would be in danger. He would just greet what came with a smile until it warranted a frown. As for what happened from here on out, there was no point in worrying about it as he couldn't change it anyway. Lionel patted Noah's shoulder. "Don't worry about it." Noah's brows arched up. For some reason he felt better after Lionel said this. But he still smiled bitterly on the outside. Lionel could only be so carefree because he didn't have any idea what would likely happen over there. Noah didn't know the full story of what happened back then, and had only ever learned some snippets, but he knew enough to know that this was a sticky situation. But much like Lionel, after seeing the gifts left on his bed, he had a bit of confidence that at least their lives wouldn't be in danger. That was why he chose to come anyway. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Noah's gaze turned back to find Kian, Vaughn and Run. It wasn't only him who noticed this, but the youths of the Muiter, Unia and Cuvan branches did so as well. Seeing the pale state of their faces, many of them were confused, but Noah gave a deep look toward Lionel, who just grinned back. Noah shook his head, and didn't say much of anything. It seemed that Lionel had benefited from those gifts far more than he had. The group of youths suddenly froze in place, their eyelashes trembling as their breathing became shallow. The few of them had rounded the final corner to finally lay eyes on the group that had come from the Luxniks. But the instant they did, it felt as though all the oxygen in the surroundings had been sucked away. There were only 3 individuals present. Each of them wore white leather armor, beautifully tailored and perfectly fitted. It followed the curves of the 2 women to perfection, and outlined the broad shoulder and chest of the man immaculately. Each had a 12-point star on their lapels and gorgeously embroidered and delicately detailed golden feathers on their tall collars. This was a uniform recognized throughout the whole of the sector, a sign of one of the mightiest and strongest fighting forces of the Luxniks, the Feather Sword Warriors. Ah, such cool uniforms. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel's words almost made Noah fall over. Whatever heavy momentum the Feather Sword Warriors had faltered as they all looked toward who spoke through the silence with incredulous expressions. The 3 Feather Sword Warriors had no idea how to respond to this. Technically, Lionel had complimented them, so there was nothing to fault him for. However, couldn't he read the atmosphere? And wasn't he supposed to be awed into silence? This wasn't part of the script at all. The male Feather Sword Warrior cleared his throat as the 2 women covered their lips. "Line up," he said coldly. The branch family youths didn't dare to be as nonchalant as Lionel. In the end, they all formed a line facing the 3 Feather Sword Warriors. Though there were thousands in the hotels, most of them were subordinates that didn't meet the 0-10 threshold and relied on the geniuses of their branches for a spot. So in the end, there were only just over 20 who appeared. In the distance, many peeked in on what was happening, but the Feather Sword Warriors didn't seem to care as the male began to speak. "Today, I will be taking you to the Luxniks family estate." The moment he said these words, a sudden bubbling of excitement took hold. But when he raised his hand to stop it, silence fell once more just as quickly. "My task today isn't just to escort you, but it's to also act as a reminder. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, in 1 month's time, the recruitment of the Void Palace will begin." The excited murmurings returned, but this time they hushed on their own. Many gripped their fists, their eyes lighting up with their hopes and dreams. "You all seem very excited by this prospect, but it's clear that this is only because you have no idea what sort of weight the Void Palace name has. There is nothing to be excited about. The Void Palace is a place where those far more talented, far stronger, and far more valiant than you all go to die. The heaviness of the atmosphere amplified, many beginning to choke on their own attempted air intake. The Void Palace is the line of defense that protects the human domain from those who seek to cause us harm. Being chosen by them means a lifetime of glory, but it also represents a lifetime of responsibility. Today, the Luxnix family will give you a chance to prove yourself and gain their nurturing for the coming month. But what you receive will still depend on your ability. Your bloodline gets you this far, and the rest will be up to you. Step forward. The group of youths did as they were told, and the teleportation platform began to flicker. When the lights faded, they too had vanished. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 11:14. When Lionel's vision cleared, he was greeted by grand golden gates. Unlike the day when the envoys of the Void Palace arrived, they were firmly shut this time around. Familiar motes of light still hung about the skies, illuminating even the day with both a delicate light and a refreshing fragrance. Standing here made even mundane air taste better than usual, the intoxicating feeling filling your lungs to the brink. Lionel's hands slipped into his pockets, his expression hard to read. It was already normally difficult to tell what was going through his head, but at the moment it seemed to be even more so than usual. The three feather sword warriors stood at the helm waiting beneath the tall gates. The guards on either side of it stood at attention, their faces obscured by their golden armor, and their bodies as rigid as statues. Lionel found this situation to be a bit odd. Since the Luxnix should have known they were coming, why was it that the gates were closed? Lionel swept another glance over the surroundings, leisurely taking it all in before his gaze once more landed on the feather sword warriors. They still stood beneath the gates without movement, but they seemed to be silently communicating with one another. It didn't take a genius to guess that they were confused about what was going on as well. This policy seemed to have changed. The male feather sword warrior spoke. Ever since that attack, security has been a bit tighter. You know that it's not that simple. It was Lady Fluttering Star Order who commanded us to do this. Visit. For the best know_vel_read_ng experience, the three fell into silence after they heard these words. Fluttering Star Order was part of the wisdom arm of the main family, but her identity was a bit more sensitive than this. She had also been experiencing the suppression of her other family members for a long while now, and it only seemed to have increased after the envoys of the Void Palace returned. The three feather sword warriors had expected to face some resistance, but they weren't in position to ignore the orders of a Star Order elder, especially since they were only 0-point feather sword warriors. They didn't have as much leeway as their 4, 8 and 12-point superiors. To many they were only considered to be trainees. Knowing the sensitivity of the issue, though they could do so, the three feather star warriors didn't dare to command the guards to open the gates. Though their status was low, that was only relative to the true big shots. Anyone who could become a feather star warrior was an elite among the main family's geniuses. Mere gate guards couldn't ignore their orders at all. However, whether one could do versus whether one should do something were two completely different matters entirely. To reach their position, these three didn't only have to have combat talent, but they were also very intelligent. They knew how to toe the political line. Fluttering Star Order had informed them to bring the branch family members to the estate, and they had done so. They had even gone out of their way to speak flowery words and made these kids feel like they truly had a chance to snatch greatness. They had done enough. If the gates were shut here, Fluttering Star Order couldn't blame them. Visit. For the best know_vel_read_ng experience, Lionel continued to silently observe this awkward atmosphere as the minutes began to tick by. However, on the inside his displeasure was already growing. He could make a guess at what was going on. Clearly not everyone in the Luxnix family were willing to welcome them with open arms, and these feather sword warriors were caught in the middle of this strife. However, this didn't stop Lionel from disliking the situation in the slightest. Yip, little Blackstar, who had found his way back to Lionel's head, patted his forehead with a small paw. At least the little guy had a conscience. Lionel had almost assumed that he would choose letting those girls play with him over following him. The little mink actually seemed to be warning Lionel about his temper, something that made Lionel himself chuckle lightly. Which of them was the older one now? You would think that little Black Star would have come back more bestial after absorbing all that void beast blood, but he was actually like this now. Alright, I know. They're a big sixth-dimensional family. I won't cause trouble. Little Black Star's paw patting Lionel's forehead again. But the look in the little guy's eye made it obvious that he didn't believe Lionel's words even for one moment. Lionel smiled and shook his head. Maybe I should just leave. How long do they expect to have me wait at this gate? The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Lionel hadn't come for the Luxnix to begin with. He had only come here because his grandfather had told him his mother was waiting for him. It was only after coming to this place that he learned about all of this Void Palace nonsense, and realized that this situation might be more complex than he thought. Unfortunately, his mother was nowhere to be seen, and he had no idea how to find her. In fact, it even seemed from those gifts that she didn't want to be found for whatever reason. In that case, why was he wasting his time here then? Having lost his patience, Lionel looked over to Noah. He planned on explaining his thoughts, and then Noah could decide for himself whether to stay or not. However, just when he was going to do so, something caught his attention. On the road on the opposite side of the closed golden gates, a white-robed old woman was walking her way forward. Though her gait seemed slow, her every step took her tens of meters. In just a few blinks, she had made it to the gate with a light smile on her face. "Open the gates." She spoke lightly, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Yes." The gate guards didn't dare to hesitate. This was a Star Order elder before them, the now infamous Fluttering Star Order. Visit. For a better user experience, more coming, smiley face. August 4th, 22. Chapter 11:15. Fluttering Star Order waited patiently as the large golden gates opened. Despite their size, the maintenance performed on them was impeccable. They swung open without the slightest noise. Even the wind itself seemed to still as they moved. The instant the gates opened, the three feather sword warriors dropped to a single knee. "We greet." Fluttering Star Order waved a hand, and the feather sword warriors shot to their feet before they could realize what was happening. "There's no need for so much formality. I'll have to thank you three for bringing over these children to me. I appreciate it." The feather sword warriors opened their mouths to say something, but in the end they closed them once more and sighed. The fact that Fluttering Star Order didn't allow them to pay respects to her seemed like an act of humility on the surface, but in practice it was her drawing a clean line between the two of them. On the one hand, this would protect them from the rage of the other Star Order elders. However, it would also mean that whatever relationship they had had with Fluttering Star Order would end from this day forth. Visit. For a better user experience, the Feather Sword Warriors couldn't help but feel complicated at this point. Fluttering Star Order had always been kind to them, but now that she was in need, they had essentially turned their back on her. However, what else could they do? They were just small rowing boats amidst a storm of black waters. Even if they braced themselves for the storm and helped Fluttering Star Order out to the best of their abilities, they would only sink along with her. It was better to have no backing at all than backing that would guarantee your death. Bowing apologetically once more, the three rushed into the estate, quickly vanishing. All the while, Fluttering Star Order hadn't spared them another glance. With a kind smile, her focus had been turned to the Branch family youths. Lionel's gaze narrowed somewhat. He could sense the tension, and could feel that this interaction entailed more than their simple words and actions would make it seem. It's clear that their actions made this elder somewhat unhappy. For them to dare to do such a thing. It seems that the situation of the elder isn't very good. That doesn't bode well for the rest of us, it seems. "Hello, I am Fluttering Star Order. You may call me Elder Fluttering for short. I've heard that the Branch families have produced quite some talents in these recent years. It seems that this wasn't incorrect." Fluttering Star Order swept a gaze over them all, but her words felt a bit empty. It was unlikely that an elder of her status would know much about them. Usually, the Branch families would be lucky if even a Feather Sword warrior came to visit their families, let alone a Star Order elder. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience when the Feather Sword Warriors had come to pick them up, it had already been greatly surprising to a few. But the sharpest among them could tell that this wasn't exactly something they could be happy about right now. In all likelihood, they had just unwittingly become chess pieces in a game of political struggle. And to make matters worse, since this elder Fluttering had to stoop so low as to use them of all people, it was clear that her back was against the wall, and she didn't have many other options. Unfortunately, they had even less options than the Feather Sword Warriors did. Even if some of them knew, they could only allow themselves to be used. Lionel suddenly felt the distinct lack of Raya. He wondered if she knew that this storm was coming and chose not to participate on purpose. But this was fine too. Unlike the others, he and Noah weren't very afraid of what might happen. In that case, they might as well go with the flow. Fluttering Star Order's expression didn't change from her cheery smile. Good. Come with me. Fluttering Star Order turned and walked into the estate. Without a choice, the youths could only follow to her back, many of them wearing heavy expressions. However, Lionel's smile had returned as he strolled forward. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. This will be interesting. The Luxnix family estate is quite large and covers about 100,000 kilometers squared. You can find everything you could ever want or need here without much issue, but there are also many restricted areas you have to be mindful of. Rather than listing them out though, it will be much easier if I point out to you all the areas you can enter. Like this, a mighty Star Order elder suddenly became the tour guide of 20-odd youths, walking through the family estate while attracting the weird glances and looks of several passers-by. Luckily, none of them dared to question the actions of a Star Order elder. As such, the group traveled deeper and deeper into the Luxnix family estate, eventually reaching a particular section of guest rooms Elder Fluttering had likely prepped for them. However, there was only so long a cover of paper could hide a smoldering fire. Fluttering Star Order. You've grown bold. The voice was a cross of shrill, crass and hoarse. If Lionel didn't know better, he would have thought that this old woman's vocal cords was forged of a fork and a steel plate. If it wasn't for Lionel's mental fortitude, his spine would have shivered beside itself. The old woman wore a white robe not much unlike Fluttering Star Order, and she had the lingering marks of a beauty in her old age as well, something both shared. However, this woman's face was far more twisted, and there was the mark of a flickering flame on her forehead. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Had Lionel been there the day the Void Palace envoys arrived, he would have recognized this woman as Sparking Star Order. It seemed that the Star Order elders were still at a head. Even now, the matter only seemed to have grown worse. Chapter 11:16. The furious aura swept out like a torrent. In that instant, several of the Branch family youths shivered and fell, their faces paling with fear. How could they possibly match up to the momentum of a sixth-dimensional expert? Even someone who had just stepped into the sixth dimension would be enough to shake them to their core, let alone Sparking Star Order, who was just a few steps from the seventh dimension. Fluttering Star Order frowned, releasing her own momentum to counter Elder Sparking. One side was like a raging wildfire and the other was a delicate breeze. They met in the middle and clashed, shooting up and dispersing into the air. However, the result was enough to send hurricane-force winds spiraling into the surroundings. The leaves of several tall trees and the well-kept grass pastures fluttered wildly, much of the greenery nearly being ripped from their branches to fall to their deaths. Fluttering Star Order turned back first to see if the youths were all right. She hadn't thought that Sparking Star Order would be shameless enough to directly target them from the very beginning, so her guard hadn't quite been up. She had been ready for a war of words, but it seemed that she had underestimated the vicious nature of her opponent. Several of the youths lay on the ground coughing up blood, but Fluttering Star Order's pupils constricted when she realized that there were two youths who were standing amidst the wild winds as though nothing had happened. Toward this result, even Sparking Star Order frowned lightly, not having expected this either. Of course, these Star Order elders didn't know that Noah and Lionel were fairly immune to such coercive attacks, at least within a certain threshold. Now that Lionel had a better understanding of emperors and kings' might, he too understood this as well. Because of this lineage factor, their focus states had always innately placed pressure on others, and it also gave them a boost to their mental defenses. The lineage factor born of Earth's Fox family was clearly not simple. You have a lot of nerve targeting my guests like this, sparking star order. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, fluttering star order quickly regained her bearings, her gaze sharpening. Her expression wasn't as ferocious as sparking star orders had been, but the solemnity in her tone was more than enough to bring her point across. Elder Sparking snapped out of her stupor, her shock settling into a sneer. Your guests? Do you take me for a fool? You're wasting valuable family resources on trash. Valuable resources? Never mind the fact that I have yet to give them anything. How valuable are treasures of the fifth dimension? You really have the face to say you worry about the scarcity of something the family has so much of? Sparking Star Order's expression darkened. In the past, Fluttering Star Order had never been so combative. When the envoys arrives, Sparking Star Order, and the others realized that Elder Fluttering's words were a bit more biting than they usually were as well. They had already decided that after the selection of the Void Palace was over, that they would find a method to expel her from the Star Order. However, it seemed that what they had forgotten to consider was the fact that maybe Fluttering Star Order was being so abrasive precisely because she was prepared to counterattack in the first place. It was only after seeing how sharp Fluttering Star Order's reply was that this finally sunk in for Sparking Star Order. But what gave Fluttering Star Order so much confidence? She was facing up against almost the whole of the Star Order Council. Even if the neutral parties were ignored, that still left about 60% of the council, while Fluttering Star Order was practically all alone. Sparking Star Order's gaze narrowed further. She wasn't a fool, nor did she believe that Fluttering Star Order was a fool either. Right at that moment, the door to the building behind Sparking Star Order opened to reveal the head of a beautiful young woman with a strong jaw. Her red-gold hair was especially striking beneath the shimmering sunlight as her eyes blinked innocently. Visit. For a better user experience, Sparking Star Order looked back for a moment, the gears of her mind churning. Raya? Lionel's brows arched, his own expression remaining placid, but the smile on his face curling all the more. He suddenly felt like this matter was only getting more interesting. What are you doing, Raya? Properly greet your elders. Ah yes, right, grandmother. Raya pretended to have forgotten basic etiquette as she scrambled to Sparking Star Order's front, bowing respectfully. Greetings, Elder Sparking. Sparking Star Order snorted, hardly acknowledging the greeting as her gaze shifted back to Fluttering Star Order. You believe that you can turn the tables by relying on the Void Palace? You are truly too naive. Do you think that just anyone can gain a place? Oh, Fluttering Star Order chuckled. Now you want to give the Void Palace its due respect? Just a few weeks ago, it was this very Elder Sparking who had raged about the Void Palace sending 2 galaxy-ranked students to them. Now she wanted to paint a grandiose picture of the Void Palace? How two-faced. Sparking Star Order didn't react much to this taunt. Much of her over-the-top temper was nothing more than a facade. The reality was that she was very good at controlling her emotions. It was just that sometimes the impact of a Karen was far better than a docile elder. This image also allowed her to step outside the bounds of the rules from time to time to get things done her way faster. After all, an emotional elder, especially an elder woman, gained a lot of leeway from many people by default. How could she not take advantage? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, regardless of how I feel about the Void Palace, the fact you want to rely on branch family trash to dig yourself out of a hole of your own creation speaks for itself. Fluttering Star Order inwardly sneered. Obviously these branch family members are just a cover, so that she could rightfully bring her granddaughter in to enjoy the resources of the Luxnix. Sparking Star Order definitely knew this as well, but that wouldn't stop her from taking multiple digs. In addition, Sparking Star Order continued unperturbed. What use is it? Will any of them rank higher than Miguel? By that point, won't all these petty games you're playing be meaningless? This time, Fluttering Star Order couldn't hold back her smile in the slightest. Miguel? What does he have to do with you? In fact, if I recall correctly, Miguel no longer has any close blood-related relatives remaining. What right do you have to claim any piece of his success? However, Fluttering Star Order's voice suddenly became so low that only someone as powerful as Sparking Star Order could possibly pick up on it. I have an outstanding granddaughter, and my grandson not only has 0.50 blood density while in the 5th dimension, but he is also the head of the Wisdom Arm's younger generation. What do you have? The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Sparking Star Order's body went rigid before she saw red. Her lack of descendants was her biggest reverse scale. Feeling it being pierced through with such venom filled her with such rage that she was about to erupt. Chapter 11:17. Author's note. Fluttering Star Order is not Lionel's grandmother. She is simply someone who sided with Lionel's grandmother at the time and received backlash for it. Now, she's trying to carve out a path for herself. Fluttering Star Order no longer held back with her words. She knew well what kind of scar this was for Sparking Star Order, especially considering how she had lost her descendants to begin with. But Fluttering Star Order no longer cared about these matters of decorum. Considering how far these matters had gone, even if she wouldn't lay all her cards face up just yet, she wasn't far from doing so either. Sparking Star Order's rage suddenly became a dark laughter. The smoldering heat of her fury simmered almost tangibly. For a moment, she truly almost lost control of herself. After she began to use this facade of a short-tempered woman, it had ironically been a very long time since anyone had blatantly provoked her in this way. So she was unused to it. It seemed that her acting skills had gotten just a bit too good. Good. Sparking Star Order nodded. I'll take your words under advisement. Sparking Star Order lightly tapped her bulbous walking stick. Her body vanishing in a flutter of butterflies formed of flames. Before they knew it, she was gone. Raya, who had just been politely bowing to Sparking Star Order, straightened out her body and looked toward her grandmother. She never knew that her grandmother had such a sharp mouth, but this only made her feel even more guilty than usual. For a usually mild-tempered woman like her grandmother to act like this now, it could be imagined how much hardship she had experienced in these past several years. Raya gripped her fists tightly. She had to claim a spot in the Void Palace for her grandmother. Only in that way could she wash away the years of humiliation she had suffered. Visit. For a better user experience, Fluttering Star Order patted her granddaughter's head with a doting expression before turning back to the rest. For the next month, you all can stay here. As I've said before, there are many areas you cannot cross into. If you die at the hands of someone you offend, there will be nothing I can do for you. For the duration of these matters, you'll be under the leadership of my granddaughter. Her expression turned far more serious as she continued. So long as you can follow instruction and work hard, there will be benefits. If not, Fluttering Star Order didn't finish her words, but the Branch family youths, many of whom were still on the ground wheezing from the earlier confrontation, felt that this woman might very well be far less amiable and caring than they had originally thought. Raya swept a gaze over the youths and shook her head. It landed on Lionel and Noah before her brows scrunched up. She remembered Lionel and Noah, and even remembered how they had met. But for some reason she felt fuzzy on some things. She shook her head and everything seemed to go back to normal. They performed better than the others. I think their bloodline density was above 0.20. That must be why I have a good impression of them. Raya thought to herself before sighing once again. Grandmother might be being a bit too harsh with this approach. Raya shook her head once more and threw such thoughts away. Visit. For a better user experience, I'll leave these matters to you, little Raya. With that, Fluttering Star Order vanished as well, a gentle brush of wind being left in her wake. Lionel stared at where the elder had disappeared, his expression fused with a mixture of amusement and coldness. He didn't need to understand the full story to know that even if Fluttering Star Order wasn't so bold as to call them trash like Sparking Star Order had, she didn't think of them very much differently at all. There was no doubt in Lionel's mind that their role here was likely to act as cannon fodder for Fluttering Star Order's granddaughter, and her grandson as well. As for what they were needed as fodder for, it was likely to be the Void Palace's selection. Lionel wasn't entirely sure how it worked, so he could only guess this to be the case. But he didn't believe that he was very far off either. So this is the Luxnix family, huh? Lionel's expression gradually lost much of its amusement to be left with nothing but indifference. Now that things had come this far, Lionel knew he couldn't leave. Never mind whether or not Fluttering Star Order would allow that, but considering how frequently that woman had mentioned how they weren't allowed to roam about the estate randomly, even mentioning how they might be killed, it was clear that this was a not-so-silent hint at just how caged they were. Visit. For a better user experience, Fluttering Star Order's stance couldn't have been more obvious. She hadn't gotten their names, didn't ask about their abilities, and she hadn't even double-checked if they really had 0, 10 bloodline density or not. It was as though it simply didn't matter to her. Lionel crossed his arm over his chest, entering a state of absolute calm. Ah. Raya suddenly snapped out of her own thoughts. Right, I will see if I can call someone over from the healing arm to help you all out. I will be right back. In the meantime, feel free to choose your rooms if you can move. The door that's closed and locked is mine, but you can choose from any of the other ones. Raya rushed away after saying these words. Clearly, the previous restrictions Fluttering Star Order had mentioned didn't apply to her in the slightest. But this much was to be expected. After all, if the grandchild of a Star Order elder couldn't move around freely, then who could? Of course, Lionel had no idea just how ironic this thought of his was. Without moving, Lionel turned his gaze over to Noah. The both of them made eye contact, and the displeasure hidden deep within their irises didn't escape the other. I feel like you had something to tell me before, right? Lionel asked. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Chapter 11:18. Lionel and Noah entered the building. It was quite the luxurious place, even several levels above the hotel the two had just been in. Lionel could feel that there was a force-gathering force art embedded into the building itself, making him feel as though he gained twice the results with half the effort in this place. The pair eventually realized that the so-called locked door Raya referred to was the entire top floor. It would have been a bit naive of them to believe after what happened before that their accommodations would be exactly the same, but after seeing the truth of it all, they couldn't help but laugh coldly. The two ended up in the dining room. There wasn't a large spread of food, but there were some small servings of fruit and snacks. Lionel had never gotten the chance to finish eating, so he just took what he could get. Noah sat across from him, seemingly hesitating on how to start. But in the end he just shook his head. I don't know the full details of the story. All I know is what I've managed to pick up from the conversations of Imperial grandfather and father. They also don't seem to like to talk about it often. Or more accurately, Imperial grandfather can't be bothered. Whenever Imperial grandfather is finished with a topic, it's too difficult to get him to open back up again. Visit. For a better user experience to start. The relationship between Imperial grandfather and grandmother is quite estranged. Though Imperial grandfather has never said that they are divorced, it's functionally no different. I have never met Imperial grandmother, but from my understanding, she is likely somewhere in the Luxnix estate, secluded from others. I'm not sure if she would even be aware of our arrival or not. As for what separated our Imperial grandparents, I wasn't sure at first, but the matter is likely related to you. Sometime in the past, not long after you were born, you were entrusted to Imperial grandmother. Your birth was very hard on Imperial aunt from my understanding, and she very nearly died. This caught many off guard because it wasn't something even the healing arm of the Luxnix predicted. Mothers sometimes face trouble during childbirth when the father comes from a far higher dimensional world. But it was thought that Imperial Aunt wouldn't have this issue due to her talent. Not only was Imperial Aunt already at the 6th dimension at the time, but she was also the wielder of Earth's world spirit. The amount of life energy and vitality she had should have dwarfed most women even of 7th dimensional worlds. Regardless of what reasons there might have been, Imperial Aunt's condition was a matter of life and death after your birth. Imperial Grandfather couldn't do anything from Earth, and Imperial Aunt had wanted to give birth by Imperial Grandmother's side, so she chose to do so in the Luxnix estate. The result was Imperial Aunt's life hanging by a thread and your father having no choice but to take her away. I have no idea where your father took Imperial Aunt to be treated, but I do know that she came back healthy and feeling better than she ever had. The trouble, though, came in what happened while they were gone. Visit. For a better user experience, though I'm not certain of where your father took Imperial Aunt, it must have been either a very dangerous location, or at least one greatly inconvenient to take a child. As a result, you were left with Imperial Grandmother. This is the point in the story where I have the largest gaps. I only have certain speculations. Something was done to you in the absence of your father and Imperial Aunt. Imperial Grandmother likely trusted the wrong people. Back then, Imperial Grandmother's status in the Luxnix family was very high, maybe only short of 1 or 2 people, if that. Due to that, she carried the weight of many duties. Your father and Imperial Aunt were gone for far longer than anyone expected. As such, things reached a point where there were certain duties that Imperial Grandmother couldn't continue to put off. As such, you were put into the care of people Imperial Grandmother thought she could trust, and the result was something being taken from you. As for what that something was, I also have no idea. Noah gazed into Lionel's eyes, but all he saw was a vast abyss looking back at him. From the start of the story to this point, Lionel hadn't spoken a single word, nor did he interrupt or show any sort of reaction. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. However, Noah could feel it. That abyss in his eyes only seemed to be getting deeper. The fact Lionel had long since stopped eating spoke volumes. This middle portion of the story is too muddled for me to give you any great details. What I do know is that whatever was taken from you also placed you on the brink of life and death. You had gone from a very healthy baby boy, likely a size too big for a child your age, to practically a shriveled-up corpse. Had Imperial Grandmother not found you in time, it was very likely that you would have died. I'm not sure where in this timeline your father and Imperial Aunt came back, but it was decided that the only way to save you was to bring you back to Earth. As for why that is, I'm not sure either. Unfortunately, Imperial Aunt had already become a student of the Void Palace. Under normal circumstances, she should have been executed for getting pregnant while having this duty in the first place. But the Void Palace, for whatever reason, looked the other way. Having already bent their rules once, they couldn't allow Imperial Aunt to bend them again to remain by your side, so she was forced to return. Lionel's expression didn't fluctuate in the slightest, however his mind was a different story. When he first awakened his dream force, all of his memories had returned like a flood. And yet, he had only remembered his mother's face, but he didn't remember his grandfather or grandmother. Why was that? The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. You actually brought us here to tend to branch family trash. Do you think my time is so worthless? A sudden sharp voice carried in from the outside to reach the ears of the pair of cousins. Lionel gently placed a half-eaten fruit down on the plate before him, and walked out with slow and deliberate steps. Chapter 11:19. Noah raised a hand to say something, but in the end he just sighed. Forget it. Imperial Aunt is probably somewhere, right? If not, Imperial Grandmother definitely is. Maybe if he makes a large enough commotion, it'll alert her before we die. Noah rose up and followed after Lionel. Lionel stepped out the building to find a fuming Raya and a group of 3 youths, each of whom wore expressions that were a cross of unhappy and sneering. Raya's height was shorter than theirs, and it really seemed as though they were towering over her. Lionel swept a glance over the situation before stepping past them toward the Branch family youths. After hearing that Raya was going to get help, Lionel had decided to leave them be. After all, he was in an odd situation and wasn't exactly sure whether he should be showing off his talents or not. The attitude of fluttering Star Order was difficult to read. However, Lionel couldn't be bothered to care right now. Why can't you just do as I've asked? They might be branch talents, but they still have Luxnick's blood. What would outsiders think if you just let them die? They still have Luxnick's blood? Don't make me laugh. How could 0.10 density garbage possibly be considered to have Luxnick's blood? I could piss out a stream with higher density than that. Raya was immediately furious. He knew that if it was another tier 8 talent on her level, or even if it was her cousin, they wouldn't dare to say these things. Even if her cousin asked them to treat a homeless man by the roadside, they would do so without hesitation. It was only because she was she that things had devolved to this level. They still had to give her respect due to who her grandmother was, but they didn't have to go overboard and bend their backs over either. The fact they had come here was enough, and no one could criticize their action already. In fact, even if they had rejected her, nothing would happen. Seeing the silence of Raya, the leading youth, a young man by the name of Alfin, sneered. However, his expression faltered a bit when he noticed Lionel. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. After a bit he sneered. You're even stowing away more trash in your personal courtyard. To think that you'd waste the family lands like this. Alfin was already unsatisfied himself because he had yet to earn such a place. He could only stay with his branch of the main family, or in the collective housing of the healing arm. Only those of the 6th dimension or 5th dimensional talents with great contributions could have a courtyard of their own. It was no wonder he was jealous. Lionel didn't even seem to hear Alfin, something that greatly displeased him. Though the branch youths on the ground tried to hide it, Alfin could sense their trembling rage toward his words. And yet, Lionel had treated him like he was heir. As though that wasn't bad enough, a second young man came out not long after and swept a gaze by him. However, Noah too didn't react much to the words of Alfin. Lionel stopped before the youths and looked them over one by one. After a while he made a decision. Snowy Grace. Lionel reached out a hand and his snow force erupted. The pressure was so great that Raya's pupils constricted, and Alfin along with the two that came with him took a step back. At that moment, delicate snowflakes began to fall upon the 20 or so youths, mimicking the falling feathers of Lionel's healing branch talent. Compared to Lionel's self-created mage art, this technique was leaps and bounds more potent. With just a bit of effort, more than 20 geniuses who each had strength near, and at tier 7 felt as though they had been given a new lease on life. That's? Alfin's brow furrowed as he watched Lionel help Vaughn up. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, thank you. Vaughn said, feeling a bit complicated. Lionel shook his head. It was a small effort. You. Alfin's voice cut through what remained of the thank yous the branch family youths wanted to speak. How do you know a core technique of our main family? Alfin's tone carried a hint of danger to it. If before he had just been here to poke some fun and throw out some insults, he was now deadly serious. The technique that Lionel had just used was one of the very best of the healing branch. Just to exchange for it took many decades of storing up merit points. Alfin himself was still 2 or 3 years away from being able to afford it, and he had only ever seen seniors much older than him, or youths far more talented than himself cast it. Alfin. Raya finally snapped. Do you think you can just treat my people however you want? If you wanted to come up with a lie, shouldn't it be far better than that? How could he possibly know such a technique? Alfin's expression darkened. Piss off, you know nothing. He continued to glower at Lionel's back. That technique was Snowy Grace. It's easily ranked top 3 among 5th dimensional healing techniques, and is known for its area of effectability. If I don't hear a proper explanation today, don't blame me for ignoring who your grandmother is. Raya's face warped. She realized then that if Alfin was willing to bring up her grandmother, he definitely wouldn't be making up nonsense. Her gaze couldn't help but turn toward Lionel. Just what was going on? Who would have expected, though, for Lionel to completely ignore Alfin entirely? He turned back, walking toward Raya's courtyard. It seemed for a moment that he was coming up to them, but it was exactly because of this that it was so shocking when he simply walked right by, not sparing Alfin a single glance. Visit. For a better _user experience, Alfin was so infuriated that he began to laugh. Trash of the branch families actually dared to treat him like this? Before Raya could awaken from her shock, Alphen had already moved. The wind crackled and popped as his fist aimed for Lionel's back. He didn't reserve himself in the slightest. In fact, he had struck to kill. The death of a mere branch family member wouldn't even be a stain on his record. For the crime of daring to ignore him, and actually having the audacity to steal techniques from the Luxnick's main family, this was exactly what he deserved. Bang! A cloud of dust shot into the skies as the surrounding grass and soil catapulted upward. Raya's expression changed. Ah! She rushed forward, cutting through the plume of falling soil. But what she found on the other side froze her in her tracks. Alphen's back bent, and a mouthful of blood shot from his lips like a bullet. Lionel stood over him. His fist still pointed downward, and his gaze partially obscured by his dangling hair. Flickering bronze runes danced across his skin before they slowly faded, making them look no different from an illusion of the light. Alphen's right arm was bent at a disgusting angle, but this was the least of his problems. With the way his back contorted as it pressed into the ground, it was clear that his spine was deformed and practically all the bones of his torso were broken. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Raya's chest heaved as Alphen's eyes rolled to the back of his head, looking into the sky with a face frozen of shock and fear. Raya's heart stopped beating entirely. A member of the branch family had just crippled a genius of the main family. It was all over. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.